My name is Ava, and I am 34 years old. I live with my husband James, and we both work for the company founded by my father-in-law. Although he is now retired, my father-in-law single-handedly transformed a small construction firm into an enterprise generating $250 billion in annual revenue. He even acquired rival companies, and while his methods could be forceful, everyone admired his remarkable business acumen. James, chosen to follow in his father's footsteps, was raised in a pampered environment and possesses a gentle nature. However, I fear his gentleness isn't suited for the cutthroat world of business. While gentle may sound pleasant, in reality, he is incredibly indecisive. I've started to doubt his suitability as a husband, let alone a CEO. James himself has admitted, "I'm not cut out to be a CEO. I'll probably just be a figurehead if I become one. It's easier for me that way." His lack of serious intention to take over the company has left me frustrated after 5 years of marriage. In stark contrast to James, I consider myself quite decisive. During his active years, my father-in-law appreciated this quality in me and entrusted me with various tasks. Before marrying James, I worked at a bank where I managed finances and always kept numbers in mind. I planned to become a full-time homemaker after our wedding, but my father-in-law requested that I join the construction company instead. Soon after I started working there, he began inviting me to board meetings and seeking my opinions on management matters. Initially, the board members were skeptical about including the founder's daughter-in-law in such important discussions. However, as I consistently offered valuable insights, they began to listen to my suggestions. Despite James being a board member, he rarely attended meetings, and this was accepted as the norm by the board and my father-in-law. One day, after returning home from a meeting, I found James nonchalantly watching TV. "Why didn't you attend today's meeting?" I asked. Angrily, "You're a key member, you should take it seriously." Without showing any remorse, he retorted, "Even if I attend, I don't really understand the discussions. Besides, the board members prefer you, so there's no problem, right?" I wondered if he was irritated by my participation in the board meetings. Despite his remarks, my father-in-law had been teaching me the intricacies of running the business and seemed to be grooming me as his successor. I had started enjoying my involvement in management, and before I knew it, I was working hard to meet my father-in-law's expectations. About 2 years after I started attending meetings, my father-in-law retired completely. Whenever there were major decisions to be made, the board members would consult me while James was sidelined. I had hoped that being in such a situation would spur James to work harder, but instead, he became even more disengaged from his work. Although he would come to the office in the morning, he would disappear somewhere by noon and stay home for the rest of the day. When he saw me at home, he wouldn't talk about work at all, seemingly indifferent to the company's affairs. Meanwhile, my workload at the company was increasing, and I was getting busier. After my father-in-law's retirement, the board members relied on me more and more, and I was tasked with duties akin to those of a CEO. Given that we were a large company with many employees, I was committed to increasing sales and profits for the sake of our workers. With the hard work of our employees, our sales began to grow. I found running the company more interesting and became more engrossed in my work. Conversely, my husband James seemed to be losing interest in his work, and his appearances at the company began to diminish. The conversations between us at home lessened, and our relationship became increasingly tense. Around that time, our lives took a different turn. James came home and casually mentioned, "I ran into your sister Megan today and we had lunch together." Megan, 2 years older than me, had just divorced about 6 months ago due to her infidelity. This led to a big commotion when her enraged husband stormed our parents' home. My husband James went to my parents' house to calm down Megan's husband in my place as I was busy with work. With his gentle upbringing and calming personality, James managed to convince Megan's furious husband to leave for the time being. Later, Megan told me, "Your husband is really something. He handled my raging husband so effortlessly." She praised James. Megan's husband, in his anger, must have been disarmed by James' calm and easygoing demeanor. Megan was able to divorce her husband after paying alimony, but since this incident, she seemed to look at James differently. Until then, she had thought of James, who was not particularly attractive and quite indecisive, as just a rich, pampered son. After the incident, she seemed to believe he was a respectable business owner. Now single after her divorce, Megan probably saw James as a great catch, given her love for wealthy men. However, I, engrossed in work, couldn't imagine such a thing. Of course, my sister wouldn't have known that James is just a nominal executive who doesn't actually manage the company. Megan's ex-husband was an elite employee of a foreign company. At their wedding, she had bragged to me, "My husband is an excellent employee with a high salary, and on top of that, he's handsome. You're jealous, aren't you?" Her ex-husband was handsome, smart, and carried a stylish vibe. I couldn't understand why she would cheat on such a wonderful husband. 3 months after hearing from James that he had lunch with Megan, I returned home to find James unusually serious. "I have something to discuss," he said. It was the first time I had heard such words from him, and I had a bad premonition. With my heart pounding, I waited for him to speak. "Actually, Megan is pregnant with my child, and I want a divorce." I was shocked by the request for a divorce, but even more surprised to hear that Megan was pregnant. At a loss for words, I listened as James continued. "Megan is planning to come over on our next day off to discuss this, so I'm counting on you." Stunned, I asked, "So you want to marry my sister?" With a troubled look, James responded, "It's not that I want to marry her, but if she's having my baby, I guess I have no choice." I sighed at James' typical indecisiveness and replied, "Well, if she's carrying your baby, I suppose it can't be helped. Let's discuss this when she comes over." It seemed like my husband and I couldn't make any decisions together, so I decided to meet directly with my sister to figure things out. Even though I had already made up my mind to divorce, I thought I needed to consult my father-in-law about the company's situation. As the daughter-in-law of the founder, I was involved in running the business, but if I divorced, I would become a stranger. The next day, I went to my in-laws' house and told my father-in-law exactly what my husband had said. My mother-in-law, who was present, was thrilled at the news of her son having a child, but quickly quieted down when glared at by my father-in-law. She seemed more concerned about her grandchild than the company's management. After some thought, my father-in-law said with a smile, "Ava, I want you to continue to be involved in the company's management as you have been. I don't care about James. I'll take the responsibility, so let him do what he likes." It seemed that my father-in-law valued the management of the company more than his son or grandchild. Even though he had retired, he still had a strong voice in the company, and since he held most of the company's shares, no executives would go against his will. I was also interested in my work and reluctant to give it up now. With my job settled, it was time to discuss the future with my sister. On my day off, my sister came to my house with a big smile. "Ava, it's a pity you couldn't have a baby. I'll give you plenty of consolation money. Please leave this house immediately," she said with a triumphant air. My husband sat silently, listening to our conversation without saying anything, despite being the one who caused the problem. I was appalled at his indifferent face. "It's okay to get divorced," I said, "but there's also the issue of alimony and division of property. Let's bring in a lawyer and decide properly." "I never thought you, my sister, would fall for a man like James," I retorted to my sister with irony. She glared at me with a stern face for a moment, but quickly regained her composure. I finally realized that it's not about looks in men, it's about what's inside. It was funny to hear my sister talk as if she fully understood my husband's inner self. Holding back my laughter, I replied, "That's great, isn't it? From now on, live happily with James." The inner self my sister was talking about was likely money. She seemed to be under the impression that my husband was the president of my father-in-law's company, but it didn't seem like she had heard anything from him. When the discussion was over, my sister said she would start living here and brought a moving company. Though I only took out the necessary items, knowing my quick-tempered sister, I had already arranged for a new apartment. I also hired a lawyer and had documents prepared for the division of property and claims for alimony. The next day, after moving out my belongings, I started negotiations for alimony and division of property with my husband and sister, accompanied by my lawyer. My husband was still present that day, sitting with an indifferent face, and only my sister was speaking. "As I said before, I'm willing to pay as much alimony as you want, so please decide at your convenience." Hearing my sister's words, my lawyer decided to also claim alimony against my sister in addition to my husband. My sister was still paying alimony in installments to her ex-husband, so my lawyer had said in advance that it might be impossible to claim alimony from her. But since she said she would pay me as much as I wanted, I decided to make a claim. When it came to negotiations about the division of property, my sister excitedly said, This mansion is originally James's family's, so it shouldn't be part of the division of property, right? The lawyer answered my sister emotionlessly. This building and the land belong to the company, so it's up to the company to decide. Even my husband seemed surprised by this. Is that so? I thought this house was Dad's, he said casually. My sister, on the other hand, was taken aback and attacked the lawyer. Wait a minute, so does that mean I can't live in this house? The lawyer responded in a businesslike manner. Since it's company property, you can continue to live here if the company allows it. At this comment, my sister seemed to breathe a sigh of relief. Oh, you should have said that earlier. It'll be fine since James, the president, will be living here. The lawyer looked surprised for a moment, then burst into laughter. What are you talking about? Ava is the president, not James. Seeing my sister, who was planning to remarry my husband yet didn't even know that fact, made me laugh. My sister immediately turned to my husband and yelled, "Ha, James, you're not the president." I stepped in for my husband, who looked troubled, and explained to my sister, James is merely an advisor without any executive rights. I'm an executive director, but I was also made president. Our father-in-law, the founder, had always been the president, but when he retired, he made me an executive director and president. The other executives appreciated my performance, so there was no opposition. On the other hand, my husband, thanks to his father's arrangement, was receiving an executive salary as an advisor without executive rights, which is more of a pity than a mere employee. Even though it's called an executive salary, since he wasn't really doing any work, it was less than what an ordinary employee would get. So, I was bearing all the living expenses. James, who didn't care about our household finances, didn't even bother to know whether the house he was living in was company-owned or belonged to his father. Although our home was company-owned, my responsible father-in-law had always charged me rent. I thought of it as a normal rental property. The lawyer, still laughing, asked me, can we continue to rent this house to James? My sister reacted to the rent part of the lawyer's question. What do you mean by rent? Are you suggesting that I take rent from James? Isn't it the company's property? Just make it free. The lawyer presented the rent amount, laughing heartily at her words. She was shocked to see the figure, and so was James, who seemed to be hearing about it for the first time. Guess a house this big does have a high rent, he muttered. I can't afford that with my salary, James admitted, realizing his executive compensation would barely leave any money after paying the rent. Covering their living expenses would be hard. Over the 5 years of our marriage, James had used up all his modest executive compensation. My salary also disappeared in high rent and living expenses, leaving hardly any assets. Splitting the savings was the only option for asset division. After the lawyer left, my sister, now aware that the mansion she had hoped for was actually rented, seemed utterly deflated, staring blankly. James was grinning as usual. I suggested, why don't we vacate this place and go back to your parents' house? Your mother was so happy about the pregnancy news. James agreed, but I laughed at the thought of why I had to consider this man, who was about to be my ex, this much. I started worrying whether this unreliable man could raise a child, but I decided to leave it as it was none of my business. I asked my sister, who seemed to have forgotten about her own alimony, are you okay with the alimony payment, sis? You seem pretty confident, but you're also paying your ex-husband, right? She was stunned to hear this, her face suddenly snapping back to reality. Alimony, I have to pay it too. She was astonished, seemingly having heard nothing of the earlier discussion. You said, I'll give plenty of alimony, but you weren't expecting me to pay it, right? My salary is really low. James and my sister exchanged surprised glances. Though not a lawyer, watching these two made me want to burst into laughter. I had already obtained signatures on the divorce papers and alimony request documents. Seeing James and my sister like this was pathetic. My ex-husband, who had remarried my sister, had returned to his parents' home, just as I had warned. But there seemed to be constant quarrels between my sister and my in-laws. The main cause of the conflict was the lie about my sister being pregnant with my ex-husband's child. His mother, who was hoping for an heir, was extremely angry. My father-in-law, who had disliked my sister for stealing his son from me from the very beginning, hadn't even spoken to her. He fronted the alimony for James, and I was paid in full. But my sister, seeing this, pleaded with him, Dad, could you please pay my alimony as well? To this, the father-in-law responded, I have no reason to be called Dad by you. He was fuming. Not being able to obtain anything she had hoped for, my sister ran away from my ex-husband's family home without a word and went missing. She had practically remarried the ex-husband just to bear the burden of alimony, which was utterly foolish. My ex-husband seemed to consider getting back with me, but his father scolded him. "You're the kind of man who should never even think about having a family. You can't even take care of yourself properly." I wouldn't get back with my ex-husband even if he begged me. I had stopped believing in him when he cheated on me with my sister and was disgusted by his indifferent attitude during our discussions. He was dismissed from his executive position and is now working as a temporary employee. I've continued being the CEO, which is the core of my life. I don't even think about remarrying someone after the breakup. I've kept in touch with my father-in-law, receiving advice when needed. For now, I want to focus on the company, thinking of it as being married to it for the sake of my employees.
I remember my childhood as a time of contrasts. While most kids complained about their parents working too much, I had to listen to my mom's daily litany about how she hated her job. Every evening was the same. She'd come home from the accounting firm, throw her bag on the kitchen counter, and start venting. "Amanda, you won't believe what my boss said today," she'd begin, barely taking off her coat. He had the nerve to question my quarterly reports. Me, I'd been doing this job for 15 years. I was only 10 at the time, but even then, I could see how different my parents were. Dad, who managed a retail chain, would just shake his head and keep eating his dinner. He was always the practical one. "Sarah," he'd say to Mom, using his calm voice that somehow made her even more agitated, "if you hate it so much, find another job." "Another job?" she'd scoff. "I don't want another job, Mark. I want no job. I want to be home, living the life I deserve." Dad would usually chuckle at this point, which never failed to send Mom into a fresh spiral of complaints. "You think it's funny? You think it's amusing that your wife is miserable?" I learned to tune out these conversations, focusing instead on whatever book I was reading or homework I had to finish. But everything changed when we got that call about Uncle Jerry. I still remember that evening clearly. Dad was unusually quiet during dinner, and Mom was going through her usual routine of complaints when he finally interrupted her. "Jerry died," he said simply, putting down his fork. Mom stopped mid-sentence. "Your Uncle Jerry? Did he leave anything?" Dad sighed heavily. "He left his estate to his nephews. I'm one of them." Mom's fork clattered against her plate. "How much?" $200,000. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my mother's face transform, the perpetual frown lines smoothed out, her eyes widened, and a smile I'd never seen before spread across her face. "Mark," she whispered, reaching across the table to grab his hand, "do you know what this means? We could buy that vacation house I've been talking about, or—" "No," Dad cut her off firmly. "Remember all those times you said you wanted to be free? Well, here's our chance. I'm going to start my own business." "A business?" Mom's voice rose an octave. "But Mark—" "A courier company," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I've been researching it for years. With this capital, we could make it work. You could quit your job and help me run it. We'd be our own bosses." Mom's face went through a series of expressions: disappointment, calculation, and finally, resignation mixed with hope. "Fine," she said eventually. "But I get to be the accountant. And when we start making money, I want nice things, Mark. Real nice things." Dad smiled and squeezed her hand. "Deal." The first 3 years were tough. Dad worked crazy hours getting his courier company off the ground, while Mom handled the books. I spent a lot of time at the office after school, watching them build something from nothing. Despite the long hours, there was an energy in the air, a sense of possibility that made even the difficult days feel worthwhile. Then, almost exactly 3 years in, everything changed. The business started turning real profit, and suddenly we were living a completely different life. We moved from our modest house to a fancy new place in the expensive part of town. Dad bought 2 Mercedes for himself and Mom. But the biggest change wasn't in our surroundings, it was in my mother. "I'm done," she announced one morning over breakfast. "Mark, I'm quitting the company. I don't want to work anymore." Dad just nodded, like he'd been expecting this. "Okay, honey. We can hire another accountant." I nearly choked on my cereal. "Just like that?" "Just like that," Mom smiled, already scrolling through her phone. "Oh look, Melissa just got back from Paris. I should call her." Melissa was one of Mom's new friends, all wealthy businesswomen who spent their days shopping and planning their next vacation. Her old friends, the ones who'd been around when we were normal, started disappearing from her life one by one. While Mom was reinventing herself, I started spending more time with Dad at the office. I tried to learn about the business, thinking maybe I'd take over someday, but my heart wasn't in it. "Dad," I said one afternoon, watching him review delivery routes, "what if I told you I don't want to run the company when I grow up? I think I want to be a dentist." Instead of looking disappointed, his face lit up. "Really? Tell me more about that." So I did. I told him about the biology classes I loved, about how fascinating I found dental procedures, about my dream of having my own practice someday. He listened to everything, asking questions and showing genuine interest. Meanwhile, Mom was barely home anymore. She was always off somewhere, Aspen, Cabo, the Maldives, with her new friends. I lost count of how many times I asked to go with her. "Mom, can I come on your trip to Europe next month?" I asked one day, watching her pack another new suitcase. She didn't even look up. "Oh honey, no. These trips are my time to get away from, well, everything. When you're older, you'll realize how exhausting family life can be." I wanted to point out that she didn't actually participate in family life anymore, she was too busy recovering from it. But I just walked away. What was the point? The mother who used to help me with homework and make chocolate chip pancakes on Sundays was gone, replaced by this stranger who cared more about her designer handbags than her daughter. High school graduation came and went, and before I knew it, I was packing my bags for dental school in another state. Dad helped me move into my dorm, setting up my room with the same careful attention he gave to everything in his life. Mom didn't come to help me move in. She was in the Bahamas with her friends, celebrating someone's new yacht. Every Sunday at 7 p.m., I'd call home. Dad would appear on screen immediately, eager to hear about my classes, my friends, my life. He'd lean in close to the camera, hanging on every word about dental procedures and anatomy lessons. Mom, when she bothered to join the calls, would hover in the background, usually scrolling through her phone. It became our routine. Sometimes Mom wouldn't show up at all, and those were actually my favorite calls, just Dad and me, talking about everything and nothing. Then came the call that changed everything. "Amanda," Dad's voice was different that Sunday. "I need to tell you something." I knew from his tone that whatever was coming wasn't good. But nothing could have prepared me for what he said next. "It's cancer. And it's aggressive." The world tilted on its axis. "What? No, that's impossible. You're healthy, you." 6 months, maybe less, he cut me off gently. "I'm selling the company. Neither you nor your mother could run it, and I want everything settled before." He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Those 6 months were a blur. I tried to split my time between school and home, watching helplessly as my father, my rock, my best friend, withered away before my eyes. He sold the company quickly, thank God, so at least he didn't have to worry about that in his final weeks. Mom fluttered around during his illness, playing the part of the devoted wife whenever anyone was watching. But I caught the calculating look she'd give his medication schedule, the way she'd check his business papers when she thought no one was looking. A month after selling the company, Dad slipped away quietly in his sleep. I was holding his hand when it happened. Mom was at a spa. The funeral was a production worthy of Broadway. Mom sobbed dramatically, clutching at the arms of her friends, barely able to stand. She looked the perfect picture of a grieving widow in her designer black dress and tastefully subtle makeup. But the moment the last guest left, it was like someone had flipped a switch. She straightened up, wiped her eyes, and walked to the mirror to fix her mascara. "Well," she said, suddenly businesslike, "that's done. Now we need to talk about the money." I stared at her, unable to process the transformation. "Mom, Dad just died." "I know, honey, and it's terrible," she said, not sounding terrible at all. "But life goes on. And just think what we could do with the money from the company sale. I've had my eye on this gorgeous villa in Spain." Then there was the reading of the will. The notary's office was cold and sterile, nothing like Dad's warm presence. Mom sat next to me in a black designer dress, different from the funeral one, of course, tapping her manicured nails against her leather handbag. Mr. Peterson, Dad's longtime lawyer and friend, cleared his throat and began reading. Being of sound mind, his voice droned on with the legal preliminaries until he got to the meat of it. "The family house is to be divided equally between my wife, Sarah Thompson, and my daughter, Amanda Thompson." Mom's tapping stopped. "Furthermore, I have established a trust fund for Amanda's continued education in dentistry, covering all expenses until the completion of her degree." I could feel Mom's tension building beside me. "The remaining assets, including proceeds from the sale of the business, are to be divided as follows: 60% to my daughter, Amanda Thompson, and 40% to my wife, Sarah Thompson." The tapping resumed, faster now, almost violent. "This is ridiculous," Mom burst out before Mr. Peterson could continue. "There must be some mistake." "There's no mistake, Mrs. Thompson," Mr. Peterson said quietly. Mark was very clear about his wishes. Mom turned to me, her face a mask of calculated sympathy. "Amanda, honey, you have to see how unfair this is. Your education is already being paid for, and you'll make plenty of money once you're a dentist. I'm your mother, I need this money to maintain my lifestyle. Maybe try spending less?" The words came out before I could stop them. Her face transformed instantly, the sympathetic mask dropping away to reveal raw fury. "How dare you? After everything I've sacrificed for you?" "What exactly have you sacrificed, Mom? You haven't worked in years. You've been on permanent vacation while Dad built everything we have. I don't have to listen to this." She stood up, gathering her designer purse and jacket. "When you decide to stop being selfish and ungrateful, you know where to find me." The door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the diplomas on Mr. Peterson's wall. "Your father knew this might happen," Mr. Peterson said gently. "He wanted to make sure you were taken care of." Days turned into weeks. No calls, no texts, no emails. The silence was deafening, but also strangely peaceful. I threw myself into my studies, trying to make Dad proud, trying not to think about Mom's reaction or what it said about her, about us. "She'll get over it," I told myself as I reviewed dental anatomy charts late at night. "She'll calm down eventually." But deep down, I knew something had broken in that notary's office, something that had been cracking for years. And unlike the broken bones and damaged teeth I was learning to fix in school, this wasn't something that could be mended with study or skill or science. One day I was taking a study break, mindlessly scrolling through social media, when I saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at: Mom, tanned and glowing, wrapped in the arms of a man who couldn't be more than 35. The caption beneath the photo stopped my heart: "Finally married to my soulmate. Newlyweds, love wins." My phone slipped from my numb fingers. Married? Without telling me? I tried calling her immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the right numbers. Straight to voicemail, of course. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of them together kept playing in my head, along with 1,000 questions. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I packed a small bag and caught the first flight home. The house looked exactly the same as when I'd left it after the funeral, Dad's rosebushes still perfectly trimmed, his favorite chair visible through the living room window. The only difference was the shiny red Porsche in the driveway that definitely hadn't been there before. Mom opened the door wearing a silk robe I'd never seen before. Her surprised expression quickly turned to anger. "Amanda, what are you doing here?" Her voice was ice cold. "I saw your post," I managed to say. "You got married?" "No one invited you here," she snapped, but before she could close the door, a man appeared behind her, the one from the photo. Up close, he looked even younger. "Babe, who is it?" he asked, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Nobody important," Mom replied. "Just my daughter who doesn't know how to call before showing up." I felt like I'd been slapped. "Your daughter who didn't even know you got married?" "My personal life is none of your business," she said, lifting her chin defiantly. "None of my... Mom, Dad's only been gone 3 months." She laughed then, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Oh, sweetie, Brad and I have known each other for years. Why do you think I took all those solo vacations? Those trips were boring. Brad made them very interesting, didn't you, darling?" He smirked, pulling her closer. I felt sick. "How could you do this to Dad?" My voice was barely a whisper. "Your father was boring," she shot back. "Always work, work, work. Brad knows how to have fun. Now, I suggest you leave before I call the police. This is my house now, and you're not welcome here." "This is half my house," I reminded her. "Dad left it to both of us." "Get out," she screamed, her composed facade cracking. "Get out of my house. Go back to your precious studies and your perfect little life that your father bought you." I backed away, tears blurring my vision. The last thing I saw before the door slammed was Brad pulling Mom into a kiss, both of them laughing. I made it to my rental car before the sobs came. All those trips, all those times she said she needed breaks from the family. How long had she been living this double life? How long had she been betraying Dad, betraying all of us? Another month has passed. I was in the middle of a dental anatomy class when my phone buzzed. Mrs. Jenkins, our old neighbor who'd lived next door for 15 years, was calling. Odd, she never called. "Amanda, honey," her voice was hesitant. "I thought you should know, there are moving trucks at your house. Your mother is selling it." The words didn't make sense at first. "That's impossible. The house is half mine." "Well, there's a sold sign in the yard, and they're clearing everything out." My hands were shaking as I dialed Mom's number, expecting the usual silence. To my surprise, she answered on the first ring. Well, if it isn't my studious daughter." Her voice dripped with sarcasm. "Mom, what's this about selling the house?" She laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, that. Yes, Brad and I got a fantastic price for it. We're moving to Mexico, the weather's so much better there." "You can't sell the house," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's half mine. Dad left it to both of us." "Funny thing about that," she said, sounding almost gleeful. "It turns out it's pretty easy to forge a signature. Just a few practice runs, and voila. The house is sold." The world tilted sideways. You forged my signature?" "Mom, that's fraud. That's a crime." "Oh please," she scoffed. "If you hadn't been so selfish with your father's money, I wouldn't have had to do this. Brad and I deserve to enjoy life. Speaking of which, I just bought him the most gorgeous Jaguar. He's so happy with it." "He's happy with your money, Mom. That's all he cares about." "You little brat," she spat. "You're just jealous because I have a gorgeous young husband who adores me, while you're all alone with your boring books and your little dental tools. What do you know about love?" "I know Dad loved you," I said quietly. "He loved you for 30 years, and this is how you repay him?" "Your father?" She laughed again, harsher this time. "Your precious father, who left you more money than me. Who treated me like I was some kind of trophy wife. Well, now I have a real trophy, a young, handsome husband who knows how to have fun." And guess what? We don't care about your American laws in Mexico. We don't care about you or your inheritance or anything else. We're going to live the life I deserve. Mom, please. Face it, Amanda. You're just a sad, lonely little girl who's jealous of her mother's happiness. When was the last time you even had a date? Too busy playing with teeth to have a real life, aren't you? Before I could respond, the line went dead. I sat there in the empty classroom, my phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the silence. My mother had just admitted to committing fraud. She had stolen my inheritance, my home, everything I had left of Dad. And she was proud of it. Life has a funny way of moving forward, with or without you. In the years following Mom's disappearance to Mexico, I finished dental school, completed my residency, and started working at a respected clinic. Dad's inheritance helped me buy a beautiful apartment in a quiet neighborhood, and I was building the life I'd always dreamed of. I thought about Mom sometimes, usually late at night when I couldn't sleep. I wondered if she was happy with her choices, if her young husband was worth destroying her family for. But mostly, I tried not to think about her at all. Then one ordinary Tuesday evening, as I was unwinding after a long day at the clinic, my doorbell rang. I wasn't prepared for what I saw through the peephole. There stood my mother, but not the perfectly coiffed, designer-clad woman I remembered. This woman was haggard, wearing wrinkled clothes that had seen better days. Her once immaculate hair was graying at the roots, and her expensive makeup was nowhere to be seen. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. "Amanda," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "Baby, please. What are you doing here?" My voice came out harder than I expected. She pushed past me into the apartment, her eyes darting around desperately. "I need your help, Brad, she choked back a sob. "He took everything." "Everything?" I couldn't help the hint of satisfaction in my voice. "All the money, the house money, what was left of the inheritance. He spent it all on gambling and parties in Mexico. And then..." She wrapped her arms around herself. "Then he met some 20-year-old at a club. They ran off together. Took the Jaguar, took what little money was left." I stood there, watching her cry, feeling nothing but satisfaction. "I used my last dollars to fly back here," she continued. "Amanda, I know I made mistakes, but I'm your mother. Let me stay here with you, please." A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside me, surprising us both. "Stay here? With me? Why are you laughing?" Her face darkened. "This isn't funny. I have nowhere else to go." "Maybe you should have thought about that before you forged my signature and stole my house," I said, my laughter dying away. "I was wrong," she wailed, falling onto my couch. "I know that now. I'm sorry. Please, Amanda, I'm your mother." "No," I said quietly. "You stopped being my mother the day Dad died. Maybe even before that. I want you to leave." She shot to her feet, tears instantly replaced by rage. "You ungrateful little bitch. After everything I've done for you." "Everything you've done to me," I corrected. "Now get out." "You can't do this to me," she screamed, mascara running down her cheeks. "I'll tell everyone what a horrible daughter you are. I'll tell them how you left your poor mother homeless. What will your fancy doctor friends think about that?" As my mother's threats echoed through my apartment, I calmly pulled out my phone. Sometimes the best weapons aren't weapons at all, they're just the truth, preserved at the right moment. "Before you continue with your threats," I said quietly, "there's something you should hear." I pressed play, and her own voice filled the room, younger, more confident, dripping with that familiar mockery from years ago. "Oh please. If you hadn't been so selfish with your father's money, I wouldn't have had to do this. It turns out it's pretty easy to forge a signature. Just a few practice runs, and voila. The house is sold." The color drained from my mother's face as she listened to her past self confess to fraud. Her legs gave out, and she sank back onto my couch. You recorded that call?" "Dad taught me to always be prepared," I said, stopping the playback. He also taught me about consequences, something you never seem to understand. You wouldn't, she whispered, but the uncertainty in her voice was clear. Wouldn't I? Fraud is a federal crime, Mom. Forging documents for financial gain? That's years in prison. I'm sure the police would be very interested in this recording. She stared at me, and for the first time I saw real fear in her eyes. Not manipulation, not calculation, genuine fear. I'll leave, she said quickly. I'll go. Just, don't. Don't what? Turn you in? Like you were just threatening to turn everyone against me? I leaned closer. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk out that door, and you're never going to contact me again. No calls, no visits, no messages through friends. If I ever hear from you again, this recording goes straight to the FBI. She stood on shaky legs, clutching her worn purse to her chest. At the door, she turned back one last time. Amanda, I'm still your mother. No, I said softly. You're just a woman who gave birth to me. My mother died a long time ago, probably around the time she started cheating on my father at those resorts. She flinched as if I'd slapped her, then hurried out the door. I stood there for a long time after she left, listening to the silence of my apartment. Then I walked to my bedroom and pulled out an old photo album, one of the few things I'd managed to save before she sold the house. There was a picture of us from when I was little, Mom, Dad, and me at the beach, all smiling, all happy. I touched Dad's face gently. I miss you, I whispered. Then I closed the album and put it away. I don't know what happened to my mother after that day. I don't know if she found somewhere to live, if she ever rebuilt her life, if she ever truly regretted what she'd done. Sometimes people ask about her, and I simply say we're not in touch. The truth is, I don't want to know. The woman in that photo album, the mother who once loved me, is gone. The stranger who showed up at my door that day? She's not my problem anymore. I was born into what you might call an ordinary family, Mom, Dad, and eventually, my younger sister Sarah. We lived in a modest two-story house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing special really. But looking back now, I can see that's where any sense of ordinary ended for me. From the moment Sarah was born, 3 years after me, our family dynamic shifted. She was a sickly baby, always catching one thing or another. Colds turned into bronchitis, ear infections became chronic, and mysterious fevers would appear out of nowhere. I remember standing on my tiptoes by her crib, watching Mom and Dad hover over her with worried faces, checking her temperature for the 100th time that day. The irony was, I never caught anything. While Sarah seemed to attract every illness floating around, I remained stubbornly, persistently healthy. Not a sniffle, not a cough, not even a skinned knee that needed more than a band-aid. You'd think parents would be thrilled to have such a healthy child, but in our house, my good health became almost an inconvenience. I was 7 when I first wished I would get sick. I remember lying in bed one night, praying for a fever or a bad cough, anything that would make Mom stroke my hair and Dad read me stories the way they did for Sarah. I even tried faking a stomachache once, but Mom just took one look at me and said, "You're fine, Gloria. Now go help me with the dishes." As we grew into our teenage years, the pattern only became more pronounced. Sarah, at 11, spent most of her time resting on the couch or in her room, while I, at 14, became practically our house's maintenance staff. It started with regular cleaning, but over time, Mom's concerns about germs turned into a full-blown obsession. Every surface had to be sanitized multiple times a day. The floors needed mopping at least 3 times, sometimes more if someone had walked through with shoes on. God forbid a speck of dust settle anywhere near precious Sarah. "But Mom, I just cleaned everything an hour ago," I'd protest, staring at the already spotless floor. "Don't argue with me, Gloria," she'd snap, thrusting the mop into my hands. "Do you want your sister to get sick? Do you want her back in the hospital?" That became her go-to weapon, guilt. Any resistance on my part was painted as a direct attack on Sarah's health. Meanwhile, Sarah would watch TV or read magazines, occasionally throwing me a sympathetic look, but never offering to help. Why would she? She was the sick one, after all. The cleaning routine became almost ritualistic. Morning, sweep, mop, dust. Afternoon, repeat. Evening, repeat again. Mom would inspect everything with the intensity of a military sergeant, finding invisible specks of dust and demanding I redo entire rooms. The smell of bleach and disinfectant became so constant that I stopped noticing it, just like I stopped noticing the ache in my arms from all the scrubbing. The constant cleaning and caretaking was wearing me down. Between school, housework, and trying to maintain some semblance of a normal teenage life, I felt like I was drowning. That's when I spotted the help wanted sign in the window of Miller's Diner, just 3 blocks from our house. I want to work there, I announced at dinner that night, watching Mom cut Sarah's meat into tiny pieces even though she was perfectly capable of doing it herself. I'm 16 now. A diner? Mom's nose wrinkled. Gloria, do you know how many germs? To my surprise, Dad spoke up. Let her try it, Helen. It might be good for her to have some responsibility. I nearly laughed at that, as if I hadn't been shouldering responsibility since I was 7. But I kept quiet, not wanting to jeopardize this unexpected support. The diner became my sanctuary. Sure, the work was hard, carrying plates, dealing with grumpy customers, cleaning tables, but it was different from the endless cleaning at home. Here, I was valued. Mrs. Miller, the owner, actually thanked me for my work. Customers left tips with genuine smiles. For 4 hours every afternoon, I wasn't just Sarah's sister or the healthy one, I was just Gloria, the reliable waitress who remembered their coffee orders. Every penny I earned went straight into my secret savings account. When Mom asked about my paychecks, I'd shrug and say I was buying school supplies or new clothes. She never questioned it. As long as they didn't have to spend money on me, they were happy. But the diner was just part of my escape plan. During the day, I threw myself into my studies with the same determination I'd once put into cleaning our house. I joined every academic club I could, entered every competition, and signed up for all the advanced placement classes our school offered. Gloria Martinez, my chemistry teacher, announced one day, perfect score on the state science Olympiad. Again. My classmates clapped, but I was already thinking about how this would look on my college applications. I needed a full-ride scholarship, my future depended on it. The day I got my acceptance letter from State University, complete with a full academic scholarship, I wasn't even surprised. I'd worked too hard for any other outcome. But I waited to tell my parents, knowing what was coming. Sure enough, a week later, Mom and Dad sat me down at the kitchen table. Sarah lingered in the doorway, pretending not to listen. Gloria, Mom began, her voice heavy with practiced martyrdom, we need to talk about college. With all of Sarah's medical bills. We just can't afford to help with your tuition, Dad finished, looking genuinely uncomfortable. The treatments have taken everything we. I got a full scholarship, I interrupted, pulling out my acceptance letter. Everything's covered, tuition, room and board, even books. You won't have to pay anything. The relief on their faces should have hurt, but I was past that. What I didn't expect was the flash of envy that crossed Sarah's face as she skulked away from the doorway. State University was 800 miles from home, and honestly, that wasn't far enough. My dorm room was tiny, with mint green walls and a squeaky bed, but it was mine. No cleaning schedules, no guilt trips, no constant reminders of Sarah's needs. I declared my major in business management right away. I figured if I could handle entitled customers and daily totals at a diner, I could handle anything the business world threw at me. We'll try to send you some money when we can, Mom had said during our weekly phone call. But Sarah's new treatment is very expensive, and... It's fine, I cut her off, already knowing the script. I found a job at the campus cafe. The cafe job wasn't bad. I worked between classes and some weekends serving overpriced lattes to sleep-deprived students and professors. The tips weren't as good as the diner, but the flexible schedule made up for it. Plus, they let us drink the mess-up drinks for free, which saved me plenty on caffeine. Sometimes I called my parents. Every conversation followed the same pattern. Mom would list Sarah's latest health issues, Dad would mumble something about bills, and they'd both find ways to mention how expensive everything was. I'd learned to keep my responses short and change the subject quickly. I only went home for major holidays. Sarah would usually be there, looking less sickly each time but still playing the role of the delicate flower. Then came the news that Sarah had graduated high school. I wasn't able to attend the ceremony, or at least, that's what I told them. Finals were a convenient excuse. "We're so proud," Mom gushed during our next call. "She's going to attend Madison College. Their medical program is excellent, and they have a wonderful student health center." I gripped my phone tighter. "That's great. How's she paying for it?" There was a slight pause. "Oh, we'd been saving." The irony hit me like a slap. After years of "we spent everything on Sarah's treatments and we just can't afford college right now," they'd somehow managed to find enough money to send her to a private college. I thought about my own scholarship applications, the countless nights spent perfecting essays while also maintaining my grades and working at the diner. "That's wonderful," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I'm happy for her." "We just want what's best for her health," Mom added, as if I might have forgotten their eternal justification. After hanging up, I sat on my bed and let out a long breath. The familiar bitter taste in my mouth wasn't exactly anger anymore, it was more like validation. Every scholarship I'd earned, every extra shift I'd worked, every penny I'd saved had been the right choice. After graduation, I landed an entry-level position at Bennett & Associates, a mid-sized consulting firm. The starting salary wasn't impressive, but I saw potential. While other new hires complained about long hours and tedious tasks, I threw myself into every project. "Martinez," my supervisor called out one Friday afternoon, "that efficiency protocol you suggested for the Thompson account? The CEO loved it. Keep this up, and you're going places." I did keep it up. Every project, every presentation, every client meeting became an opportunity to prove myself. I developed a reputation for innovative solutions and attention to detail. When I proposed a new customer relationship management system that saved the company thousands, the senior partners took notice. The promotions came steadily after that. Junior analyst to senior analyst. Senior analyst to project manager. Each step up meant more responsibility, more respect, and yes, more money. I moved from my cramped studio to a decent one-bedroom apartment, bought some proper furniture, started building an emergency fund that had nothing to do with escaping my family. "Your quarterly numbers are exceptional," Mr. Bennett himself told me during my third-year review. "How would you feel about heading up our new digital transformation division?" I was 30, making six figures, and finally feeling like I'd built something solid for myself when the call came. "Gloria, honey," Mom's voice had that forced cheerfulness I remembered so well. "You must come visit this weekend. This is important family news. Sarah will be so disappointed if you're not here." Some things never change. I rearranged my schedule, delegated some tasks to my team, and booked a flight home. The house looked exactly the same when I arrived, maybe a few more cleaning supplies by the door, but otherwise unchanged. Sarah's car was in the driveway, along with an unfamiliar blue sedan. Mom opened the door before I could knock. "Gloria, come in, come in. Everyone's in the living room." Sarah was perched on the couch next to a tall man with glasses and a nervous smile. Dad sat in his usual armchair, and Mom quickly reclaimed her spot next to Sarah. "Gloria," Sarah beamed, "this is David, my fiancé. We're getting married." Sarah continued, holding up her left hand to display a sizable diamond ring. "The engagement party is in 2 weeks. You'll come, right?" I managed a smile and appropriate congratulatory noises. David seemed nice. But something felt off. Throughout dinner, the conversation kept circling back to my career. Mom, Dad, even Sarah couldn't stop asking questions. "So what exactly is your title now?" Mom pressed. "And you manage how many people?" Dad wanted to know. Digital transformation, that sounds impressive, Sarah mused. Must pay well? I answered each question vaguely, years of practice helping me deflect their increasingly pointed inquiries about my finances. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this sudden interest in my career success wasn't just casual conversation. 2 weeks flew by in a blur of work deadlines and project meetings. Before I knew it, I was back in my hometown, pulling up to the Grand Plaza, easily the most expensive restaurant in the city. Sarah waved to me from the entrance, wearing a designer dress I knew she couldn't afford on her entry-level nurse's salary. David stood beside her, looking uncomfortable in his new suit. The private dining room was packed with faces I barely recognized, distant relatives, old family friends, what seemed like David's entire extended family. Crystal glasses clinked, waiters glided between tables with bottles of champagne, and elaborate flower arrangements centered each table. The evening progressed through course after expensive course. Imported caviar, Wagyu beef, vintage wines. I couldn't help doing the mental math, this had to be running into the thousands. On my last visit, Sarah had mentioned struggling to make her student loan payments, and I knew David worked at a local library. The numbers weren't adding up. Another bottle of champagne for table 3. Sarah called out to a passing waiter, not even glancing at the wine list. She caught my eye and smiled. We have to celebrate properly, right? Finally, as the dessert plates were being cleared and guests were starting to gather their things, the restaurant manager approached our table. He was carrying a leather folder. The evening's final bill, he announced, looking expectantly at the group. Before anyone else could move, Sarah gave an airy wave. Oh, my sister Gloria will take care of that. She smiled at me with artificial sweetness. She's very successful, you know, a big executive in the city. The manager turned to me and extended the folder. I took it, opened it, and felt my blood run cold. The number at the bottom had far more zeros than I'd expected, even with my worst-case calculations. I looked up to find every eye at the table on me. Mom and Dad wore identical expressions of studied nonchalance, as if this had been the plan all along. David looked mortified, but said nothing. And Sarah? Sarah was smirking, actually smirking, like she'd just pulled off some clever trick. They'd planned this. All of it, the excessive menu choices, the premium wines, the endless appetizers. The constant questions about my job and salary during their surprise announcement. They'd set me up, assuming I wouldn't dare cause a scene at my sister's engagement party. I closed the bill folder and stood up slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The restaurant had grown quieter, other guests sensing the tension at our table. I'm not paying this bill, I said, my voice steady. This is the first I'm hearing about any of this. Sarah's face contorted. What do you mean you're not paying? Of course you're paying. You're my sister. Gloria, Mom hissed, don't make a scene. David's parents exchanged alarmed looks. His mother leaned forward. I'm sorry, what's happening? We thought the bill had been arranged. Nothing was arranged, I said, looking directly at Sarah. They just assumed I'd pay without asking me. Sarah shot up from her chair, face red. You selfish bitch. You make all that money and you can't even help your own sister? What kind of person are you? Sarah, honey, please calm down, David tried to intervene, reaching for her arm. She yanked away from him. Don't tell me to calm down. She's ruining everything. She's always been jealous of me. The scene devolved quickly. Sarah grabbed a wine glass and hurled it against the wall. Then a plate, then another. Crystal shattered, guests gasped, and David's parents stood up, horrified. David tried again to calm her, but she shoved him so hard he stumbled backward into a waiter. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I grabbed my purse, walked out of the restaurant, and drove straight to the airport. I booked the first flight home while sitting in the terminal, my hands shaking not from fear or anger, but from a strange sense of relief. The mask had finally dropped. They couldn't pretend anymore. My phone started ringing at 7 a.m. the next morning. Mom's number. "How dare you," she screeched, before I could even say hello. "You've ruined everything." Sarah is devastated. "The engagement is probably off now, and it's all your fault." "My fault?" I let out a harsh laugh. "You tried to scam me." "Scam you? We're family. You make more than enough money to help your sister have her special day. You're just being selfish, like always." Dad's voice cut in. They had me on speaker. "You humiliated us in front of everyone. You need to make this right." "Make it right?" I repeated. "You mean pay for the bill you tried to trick me into covering?" "Well, yes," Mom said, as if it was obvious. "And since you've caused all this trouble, you should pay for the wedding too. The venue Sarah wants is $40,000, and that would be a good way to apologize." I couldn't help it. I started laughing. Not polite laughter, but deep, borderline hysterical laughter. "Let me be very clear," I said when I could speak again. "I'm not paying for the engagement dinner. I'm not paying for the wedding. I'm not paying for anything. And please, don't call me again." I hung up, blocked their numbers, and went to make coffee. I had a meeting in 2 hours, and I wasn't going to let their drama derail my life anymore. A week after the restaurant disaster, I was scrolling through Facebook during my lunch break when I saw it. David's relationship status had changed to single. A few clicks revealed that Sarah had removed all their photos together. The engagement was off. I wasn't surprised. After watching Sarah's meltdown, any sane person would run for the hills. What did surprise me was the post that appeared on my feed later that evening, written by my mother and shared by what seemed like every relative we had. "With heavy hearts, we must announce that Sarah's engagement has ended. While we usually keep family matters private, we feel we must speak out about the cruel and deliberate actions that led to this heartbreak. Our eldest daughter, Gloria, had promised to help with the engagement celebration and wedding costs, knowing how much this meant to her sister. But at the engagement dinner, she purposely humiliated Sarah in front of both families by refusing to pay the bill she had agreed to cover. This calculated act of sabotage came from a place of longtime jealousy and resentment. We have always known that Gloria envied the attention Sarah needed due to her health issues, but we never imagined she would stoop so low as to deliberately ruin her sister's happiness. Sarah is devastated, and David's family was so shocked by the scene that they encouraged him to reconsider the marriage. Our family is torn apart because one person chose spite over sisterly love. To those who wonder why we're sharing this publicly, we believe it's important to stand up to toxic behavior, even from family members. Especially from family members. The comments poured in like poison. I always knew there was something off about Gloria. So cold and distant at family gatherings. Poor Sarah. She's been through so much already with her health issues, and now this betrayal from her own sister. How could anyone be so heartless? Family should support each other. Aunt Margaret, who hadn't spoken to me in years, chimed in, "Helen, I'm so sorry your daughter turned out this way. You and Richard were such wonderful parents to both girls. Some people are just born selfish." Cousin Rachel, who'd attended the engagement, I was there. Gloria just walked out while Sarah was crying. She didn't even try to explain or apologize. Shocking behavior. Even distant relatives I barely remembered were joining the pile-on, each comment more viciously righteous than the last. Not one person questioned my parents' version of events. Not one person wondered why I might have refused to pay. Not one person reached out to hear my side. The narrative was set. I was the villain who destroyed my sister's happiness out of jealousy. The successful but bitter older sister who couldn't stand to see her younger sibling happy. The cold-hearted career woman who chose money over family. I began typing. I've never been one to air family drama publicly, but since my parents have chosen to share their version of events, I feel compelled to share the truth. No, I never promised to pay for Sarah's engagement dinner or wedding. In fact, I knew nothing about these supposed obligations until the restaurant bill was handed to me at the end of the evening. The truth is simple. My parents and sister orchestrated an elaborate dinner at one of the most expensive restaurants in town, invited 50 guests, ordered premium everything, and then expected me to cover the massive bill without any prior discussion or agreement. When I refused to pay for this surprise expense, Sarah had a meltdown that included throwing and breaking restaurant property. I left to avoid escalating the situation. The next morning, my parents called to berate me. They demanded I pay not only for the engagement dinner but also for a $40,000 wedding. They never denied planning this ambush. In fact, they defended it by saying I'd make enough money to cover these expenses. Don't take my word for it. Listen for yourselves. I attached the audio file. I'd recorded that morning's phone call out of pure instinct, thank goodness. Their voices rang out clear and damning. Mom, you make more than enough money to help your sister have her special day. Dad, you need to make this right. Me, you mean pay for the bill you tried to trick me into covering? Mom, well, yes. And since you've caused all this trouble, you should pay for the wedding too. The venue Sarah wants is $40,000. The comments started immediately, but these were different. Oh my God, Gloria, I am so sorry for assuming the worst. I can't believe they tried to stick you with a bill like that without warning. Who does that? Helen and Richard, you should be ashamed of yourselves. This is exploitation, not parenting. Aunt Margaret, Gloria, honey, I owe you the biggest apology. I should have known there was more to this story. Cousin Rachel, I was at that dinner and I knew something felt off about the whole thing. I should have spoken up sooner. I'm so sorry, Gloria. Even some of David's family members commented, saying they'd had concerns about Sarah's behavior and stability, and that the broken engagement had more to do with her actions than anything I'd done. My parents tried damage control, claiming the recording was taken out of context, but it was too late. The truth was out. I didn't stick around to watch the fallout. I blocked my parents' numbers, blocked them and Sarah on all social media, and deleted the Facebook app from my phone. Enough was enough. That was 6 months ago. I haven't spoken to any of them since. Sometimes I get messages from relatives passing along news, Sarah's seeing a therapist now, Mom and Dad are in family counseling, but I don't respond. Maybe someday they'll understand the damage they've done, but I'm not holding my breath. For now, I'm focused on my life, my career, and the family I've chosen, friends who support me without trying to exploit me. And for the first time in my life, I don't feel guilty about putting myself first. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is walk away. Even from family. Especially from family. My earliest memories are tainted with the subtle sting of comparison. Why can't you be more outgoing like your sister? Mom would say, shaking her head as I sat reading in my corner while Katie entertained guests with her theatrical stories. I was 8, she was 6, and already the pattern was set. Emily, honey, why don't you join the conversation? Dad would encourage, but his tone carried disappointment rather than support. Meanwhile, Katie would be perched on his knee, getting all the laughs with her silly jokes and animated expressions. The favoritism wasn't just in the little things, it showed up in every aspect of our lives. When Katie started ballet classes at age 7, she got brand new pink tutus and the most expensive shoes. When I asked to join band class a year later, Mom sighed about the budget and found me a second-hand flute on eBay. I remember one particular Christmas when I was 12. I'd been hoping for a new laptop to help with my schoolwork. Instead, I got some clothes and books, while Katie received an iPhone, despite being only 10. She needs it to stay in touch with all her friends, Mom justified, while I swallowed my protests about needing the laptop for my advanced placement classes. My grandmother, Dad's mother, was the only one who seemed to see me for who I was. During those endless summers when my parents took Katie on family vacations without me, Grandma Martha would welcome me into her small but cozy house with open arms. "They're leaving me behind again," I complained one day, fighting back tears as I watched them pack the car for another trip to Disney World. Grandma pulled me close and whispered, "Their loss, sweetheart. You and I will have our own adventure." She always made those abandoned summers special, teaching me to bake her famous apple pie and telling me stories about her own childhood. One evening, when I was 15, I overheard my parents talking in the kitchen. I'd stopped to get a glass of water after hours of studying for my SATs. "We need to start thinking about college funds," Dad was saying. "Well, we can only afford to send one of them," Mom replied matter-of-factly. "Katie's showing such promise in drama club, she could really make it in performing arts." "What about Emily?" Dad asked, but his voice lacked conviction. "Emily's smart. She'll figure something out. Maybe she can get scholarships." I stood there, glass forgotten in my hand, as their words sank in. That night marked a turning point for me. If they wouldn't invest in my future, I'd have to do it myself. From then on, I threw myself into every academic opportunity one could find. Science fairs, debate clubs, math competitions, I participated in them all. While Katie was going on dates with boys from her middle school class, I was staying up late preparing presentations and polishing my college applications. "Emily, you're just jealous that your sister has a social life," Mom would say whenever I tried to point out that Katie's boy-crazy behavior seemed inappropriate for a 14-year-old. I'd retreat to my room, clutching my academic medals and certificates, reminding myself that someday, all this work would pay off. Someday, I'd build a life where I wouldn't have to compete for love or attention. I just had to survive high school first. All those late nights of studying and participating in every possible academic competition finally paid off. I graduated as valedictorian of my high school, with a full scholarship to State University School of Business Management. The day I got my acceptance letter, I ran to show my parents, but they were busy helping Katie prepare for her latest date. Moving to the dorms was like taking my first real breath of fresh air. My roommate, Sarah, became the sister I'd always wanted, someone who actually celebrated my achievements and supported my goals. The distance from my family felt liberating rather than lonely. The rare phone calls home always followed the same pattern. "Katie's dating the captain of the football team now," Mom would gush, not even asking about my classes. "She's so popular, everyone just loves her. Are you dating anyone, Emily?" I'd mumble something about focusing on my studies and end the call as quickly as possible. The truth was, I was thriving. My professors praised my work ethic, and I was making real friends who valued me for who I was. Then, in my third year, the bomb dropped. During one of our infrequent family calls, Mom casually mentioned, "Oh, by the way, Katie got accepted to Prestige University. We're so proud. We found her the cutest apartment near campus, you should see the view. Your father and I are handling all the expenses, of course. We want her to focus on her studies without worrying about money." I sat there in my cramped dorm room, phone pressed to my ear, fighting back tears of anger and hurt. The same parents who couldn't afford to help me with college were now fully funding Katie's education at one of the most expensive universities in the country. But I channeled that anger into determination. I graduated with honors and landed a job at Mitchell & Associates, one of the top consulting firms in the city. 2 years of working my ass off earned me a promotion to senior consultant. The night of the announcement, my colleagues insisted on taking me out to celebrate at the Blue Room, a trendy bar downtown. That's where I met James. He was charming, successful, and actually interested in hearing about my career. We exchanged numbers, and soon we were dating. For 2 years, everything felt perfect. James made me feel valued and loved, something I'd never really experienced with my family. Then came the wedding invitation from Katie. She was marrying Richard Thompson III, some hotshot real estate developer she'd met at college. I almost didn't go, but James convinced me it would look worse if I didn't attend. The wedding was exactly what you'd expect, over the top and excessive. Katie practically floated around in her designer gown, making sure everyone knew she was becoming Mrs. Thompson before her big sister had even gotten engaged. I always knew I'd be first down the aisle, she smirked when we had our obligatory sister moment at the reception. "I mean, you were always so focused on your career and everything. But don't worry, Em, maybe someday you'll find someone too." I plastered on my best fake smile and sipped my champagne, reminding myself that her approval didn't matter anymore. I had a good job, a loving boyfriend, and a life I'd built entirely on my own terms. A year after Katie's wedding, James and I were living together in a cozy apartment downtown. One night, after making dinner together, he got down on one knee in our tiny kitchen and took out a ring. My heart soared. I said yes and practically jumped into his arms. The ring wasn't as flashy as Katie's massive diamond, but it was perfect for me, elegant and understated. When I called my parents to share the news, Mom's response was predictably lukewarm. "Oh, that's nice, dear. We should meet him properly. Bring him over this weekend." The meeting was exactly as uncomfortable as I'd expected. Katie showed up uninvited, of course, wearing a designer outfit that probably cost more than our monthly rent. "So you finally found someone willing to marry you," she said with that familiar condescending smile. "I was starting to worry you'd end up alone with your spreadsheets and PowerPoint presentations." James squeezed my hand under the table, helping me keep my cool. To my surprise, Mom and Dad seemed to warm up to him during dinner. "We should host your engagement party," Mom suddenly announced. "We'll handle everything. It's the least we can do, considering we couldn't contribute to your education." The casual way she mentioned their financial favoritism made my blood boil, but James looked so excited about the idea that I agreed. 2 months later, we drove back to my parents' house for the party. They had actually done a nice job with the decorations, and seeing all our relatives gathered to celebrate us made me think that maybe, just maybe, things were changing. Katie showed up alone, explaining that Richard was away on business. She kept making snide comments about my dress being budget-friendly and how she could recommend a better wedding planner than the one we were considering. The party was in full swing when I realized I hadn't seen James for a while. "Has anyone seen my fiancé?" I asked, but everyone was too busy enjoying themselves to pay attention. Something felt off. I started searching through the house, eventually heading upstairs. As I approached my old bedroom, I heard noises that made my stomach drop. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, and there they were, James and Katie, tangled in the sheets of my childhood bed. "Emily, wait. I can explain." James scrambled to get dressed, his face red with either shame or exertion, I couldn't tell which. Katie didn't even bother covering herself properly. She just lay there with that smug smile I'd known my entire life. "Oh, Emily," she purred, "James just figured out what I've known all along. I'm the better sister. Always have been, always will be." My hands were shaking so badly I had to lean against the doorframe. 28 years of being second best, and now this? I opened my mouth to scream, to finally let out decades of hurt and rage. But before I could, Mom and Dad burst into the room, obviously having heard the commotion. Mom took one look at the scene and burst into tears. "Emily, sweetie, please," she grabbed my arm, her voice trembling. "You can't tell anyone about this. Think about your sister." Dad joined in, his face ashen. "If Richard finds out about this, he'll divorce her. There's a prenup, she won't get a penny. Please, Emily, think about what this would do to the family." I stared at them in disbelief. Even now, even after catching my fiancé in bed with my married sister, their only concern was protecting Katie. "Please, baby, I'm so sorry." James was fully dressed now, reaching for me. "It was a mistake." She came onto me, and I yanked my arm away from his grasp. The clarity that washed over me in that moment was almost peaceful. Without a word, I turned and walked downstairs to where our guests were still celebrating. "Everyone," I called out, my voice surprisingly steady. "I have an announcement to make. There will not be a wedding. I'm very sorry for any inconvenience this may cause, especially to those who traveled to be here today. Please enjoy the food and drinks, but I need to leave now." Ignoring the gasps and whispers, I grabbed my purse and car keys. I could hear James calling after me, could see my mother's mascara-streaked face pleading with me, but I didn't stop. The drive home was a blur. As soon as I got to my apartment, I went into autopilot mode. I pulled out every cardboard box we had stored in the closet and methodically packed up James's belongings. Clothes, books, his precious golf clubs, everything that was his went into boxes. I drove to the nearest storage facility, rented a unit, and dropped off all his things. Then I sent him one final text with the unit number and access code before blocking his number, his email, and all his social media accounts. My phone kept buzzing with messages from my parents, warnings about family loyalty, pleas to keep quiet about what happened, guilt trips about how this would destroy Katie's marriage. I blocked their numbers too. As I sat alone in my half-empty apartment that night, I realized something. This wasn't just about James's betrayal. This was the culmination of a lifetime of my family choosing Katie over me. They'd chosen her happiness over mine one too many times, and I was finally done. I poured myself a glass of wine and deleted Katie's contact information next. Then my parents. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. 3 years after the engagement disaster, I was grabbing coffee at a local market when I literally bumped into Michael. My coffee splashed all over his white shirt, and instead of getting angry, he laughed and asked if I'd let him buy me another one. I hesitated. After James, I'd sworn off dating, throwing myself into my work instead. But there was something different about Michael. Maybe it was his genuine smile or the way he didn't try too hard to impress me. I promise I'm not a serial killer, he joked, noticing my reluctance. Just a clumsy architect who'd like to replace your coffee and maybe get your number. Just coffee, I said firmly, but somehow that coffee turned into dinner, and dinner turned into more dates. Michael never pushed. He understood my trust issues when I finally told him about James and Katie, and he let our relationship develop at my pace. No grand gestures, no rushing, just genuine care and respect. 2 years later, he proposed during a quiet evening at home. No fancy restaurant, no audience, just us, some takeout Chinese, and a simple but beautiful ring. I said yes without hesitation. When his parents, Tom and Linda, insisted on throwing us a big wedding, my first instinct was to refuse. But they were so genuinely excited about welcoming me to their family, and Linda even took me shopping for a wedding dress, insisting on paying for it herself. I invited Grandma Martha first, she'd been my rock through everything. Then my aunts, uncles, and cousins who had always treated me with genuine affection. But the question of my parents loomed large. After weeks of internal debate, I finally picked up the phone. "Mom? It's Emily." "Emily," she sounded shocked, but happy. "We've heard about your engagement from Aunt Sarah. We were hoping. I'm calling to invite you and Dad to the wedding," I cut in before I could lose my nerve. "Oh, sweetheart, we'd love to come. Have you sent an invitation to Katie and Richard? You know your sister would want to be there." "No," I said firmly, my hand tightening around the phone. "And I won't be inviting her. She lost that right when she slept with my fiancé at my engagement party. While she was married, I might add." I expected the usual protests, the usual excuses for Katie's behavior. Instead, there was just silence on the other end of the line. "The wedding is next month," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I'll email you the details." My wedding day started perfectly. The venue looked beautiful, Michael's family had handled every detail with love and care, and I felt like a princess in my dress. But that perfect bubble burst the moment I walked into the reception hall. There she was, Katie, standing next to our parents, wearing a tight dress that showed off her obviously pregnant belly. She had that same smug smile I'd seen in my old bedroom 3 years ago, and she had the nerve to wink at me. Her husband, Richard, standing next to her. I marched straight to my parents, my hands shaking with rage. "What is she doing here?" I hissed. I specifically said she wasn't invited. "Now, Emily," Mom said in that patronizing tone I knew so well, "you're being ridiculous. Katie is your sister. Of course she needs to be at your wedding. That unfortunate incident was years ago, it's time to move on and forgive." I felt my world starting to spin, but then Michael's hand found mine and squeezed gently. His touch anchored me, reminding me that this was our day, and I wouldn't let them ruin it. I took a deep breath and walked away, focusing on the fact that I was marrying the most wonderful man I'd ever met. The ceremony went smoothly, and soon we were at the reception. Everything was fine until the toasts began. Mom stood up first, glass in hand. "I'm so happy that my second daughter has finally found her match," she said, smiling at the crowd. Though of course, Katie was first down the aisle, wasn't she? "You two have always been so close, sharing everything." She went on and on about Katie's wedding, her marriage, her pregnancy, barely mentioning me or Michael. I gripped my champagne glass so hard I thought it might shatter. Michael's mom, Linda, reached over and patted my knee sympathetically. But the worst was yet to come. Katie stood up next, smoothing her dress over her pregnant belly. As the maid of honor at my own wedding, she started, completely ignoring the fact that I'd barely attended her wedding, let alone been part of it. "Emily has always looked up to me. And I've always looked out for her. In fact, a few years ago, I actually saved her from making a huge mistake." She paused for dramatic effect, shooting me a knowing look. "She owes me for that, really. Everything I've done has been for her own good." The sheer audacity of her words, twisting her betrayal into some sort of sisterly favor, made my blood boil. She was actually standing there, at my wedding that she wasn't even invited to, bragging about sleeping with my ex-fiancé. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were trembling, but my resolve was firm as I stood up, my champagne glass still in hand. "You know what? Let me tell you all a story," I said, my voice clear and strong, despite my racing heart. "Yes, I love Michael with all my heart. He's the best thing that's ever happened to me. He's shown me what real love and support look like. But a few years ago, I was engaged to another man. We had our engagement party at my parents' house, just like Katie mentioned, the party she so conveniently left out the details about." The room fell silent. Katie's smug smile began to fade, replaced by a look of uncertainty I'd never seen on her face before. During that party, my dear sister, who was married at the time, I might add, decided to seduce my fiancé. While her husband was away on business, I found her in bed with the man I was supposed to marry. In my childhood bedroom, no less. The same bedroom where I spent countless nights studying to earn my own way through college, while our parents paid for her apartment at that prestigious university. Gasps echoed through the reception hall. The sound of silverware clattering against plates punctuated the shocked silence. Richard, Katie's husband, stood up slowly, his face ashen, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "Is this true?" Katie's perfectly crafted composure finally cracked. Her mascara began to run as tears welled up in her eyes. "Yes, but Richard, I can explain. It wasn't like that." Richard turned and walked out of the reception hall without another word, his steps echoing in the stunned silence. Katie ran after him, her pregnant belly making her awkward as she rushed through the door, calling his name desperately. "Emily!" Mom screeched, her face contorted with rage, her carefully styled hair coming loose as she jumped to her feet. "How dare you? You've ruined everything. Why couldn't you just keep quiet like you always do? Why did you have to make a scene at your own wedding?" "No, Mom," I replied calmly, feeling oddly peaceful now that the truth was finally out. "You ruined everything when you brought her here after I specifically said she wasn't invited. You ruined everything every time you chose her over me. You ruined everything when you defended her after she betrayed me in the worst possible way. This is just the consequences of your choices finally catching up to all of you." Our parents stormed out, following Katie and Richard, their angry mutters fading as they left the hall. The reception hall was silent for a moment, the tension thick in the air. Then Michael stood up and took my hand, his touch gentle and reassuring. "Well," he said with a warm smile that reached his eyes, "I believe we were in the middle of celebrating our wedding. Would anyone like to dance?" Aunt Sarah was the first to start clapping, followed by Grandma Martha, then Michael's family, and soon the whole room was applauding. Linda hugged me tight, whispering, "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. You did the right thing." The aftermath of my wedding unfolded like a soap opera, but I watched it all from a safe distance while enjoying my honeymoon in Hawaii with Michael. Through family gossip, mainly from Aunt Sarah and Grandma Martha, I learned about everything that happened after Katie chased Richard out of our reception. Richard filed for divorce the very next week. Katie tried everything to stop him: tears, promises, threats, but he wouldn't budge. When her baby was born 2 months later, Richard demanded a DNA test. I wasn't surprised when it revealed what Katie probably knew all along: the baby wasn't his. Thanks to their prenup and the proof of her infidelity, Katie walked away with nothing. No alimony, no house, no luxury car, nothing but the clothes in her closet and her collection of designer handbags. Mom and Dad had to sell their vacation home to help pay for Katie's legal fees. She moved back in with them, bringing her newborn son with her. The irony wasn't lost on me: the golden child who had everything handed to her on a silver platter was now sleeping in her old bedroom, living off our parents' retirement savings. They tried to blame me, of course. The angry phone call started about a month after my wedding. "You've ruined your sister's life," Mom screamed into my voicemail. "If you had just kept your mouth shut, everything would have been fine. You're no longer our daughter," Dad declared in his message. "We raised you better than this." I blocked their numbers again, but they found new ways to reach out: emails, messages through relatives, even a letter sent to my office. Each time, the message was the same: I was the villain in their story, the jealous older sister who destroyed poor Katie's perfect life. But I had a new life now, one filled with love and genuine support. Michael's family welcomed me with open arms. His mother Linda called me every Sunday just to chat. His sister became the best friend I never had growing up. Even his gruff father Tom showed his affection in his own way, always making sure to save me the biggest piece of his famous barbecue brisket at family gatherings. "You know what the best part of marriage is?" Michael asked me one evening as we cuddled on our couch, watching the sunset from our new home, the one we bought together, without any help from either of our families. "What's that?" "Getting to choose your family," he said, kissing my forehead. "Blood doesn't always mean love, but love always means family." He was right. I finally had what I'd always wanted: a family that loved me for who I was, not what they wanted me to be. A husband who celebrated my successes instead of comparing them to someone else's. In-laws who treated me like a daughter, not a disappointment. Grandma Martha still visits us regularly, and she adores Michael. "I always knew you'd find your way, sweetheart," she told me during her last visit. Sometimes the hardest paths lead to the best destinations. I don't know what happened to Katie after that, and honestly, I don't care to know. I heard through the grapevine that she's still living with our parents, trying to rebuild her life. Sometimes I wonder if they finally see her for who she really is, or if they're still making excuses for her behavior. But those thoughts don't keep me up at night anymore. I have my own family now, one built on trust, respect, and genuine love. Michael and I are expecting our first child, and I know this baby will grow up in a home where they're valued for exactly who they are, not compared to anyone else. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's living well. And that's exactly what I'm doing. My name is Madison, and I came into this world as an afterthought, born to parents who were already in their 40s and had a 10-year-old daughter they considered more than enough. "We didn't plan for you," my mother would often say, not maliciously, but matter-of-factly, as if stating the weather. "If it wasn't for your grandparents' insistence." She'd trail off, leaving the rest unsaid, but the message was clear: I was here because my maternal grandparents had convinced my reluctant parents to have another child. They were overjoyed at the prospect of a second granddaughter, while my parents viewed me as an obligation they hadn't asked for. My sister, Sarah, was already deep into her own world of teenage concerns when I arrived. She wasn't cruel or mean, she simply acted as if I didn't exist. While I played with my dolls in the corner of our shared living room, she'd be sprawled on the couch, talking on the phone about boys and college applications, completely oblivious to my presence. "Sarah, honey, don't forget your SAT prep books," Mom would say, carefully arranging them in her backpack. Meanwhile, I'd be sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for someone to notice I needed help with my homework. But help rarely came from my parents. Instead, they developed a routine that shaped my entire childhood. Every morning, they'd drop me off at my grandparents' house. "You wanted her," my father would say to my grandfather, keys jingling in his hand as he prepared to leave for work. "She's all yours." My grandparents' house became my real home. They picked me up from school, helped me with my homework, took me to the park, and made sure I was fed and cared for. Only late at night would my parents come to collect me, usually looking tired and slightly annoyed at having to make the trip. "Madison," my grandmother would say, hugging me goodbye each night, "you're the best thing that ever happened to us." And in those moments, wrapped in her warm embrace, I could almost forget that I wasn't wanted elsewhere. This pattern continued day after day, year after year. While my sister prepared for her bright future, I learned to navigate life as an afterthought in my own home. But my grandparents' love was constant, unwavering, and it was in their home that I learned what it meant to be truly valued. One day, my grandfather would tell me as we worked on my math homework, "You'll understand that sometimes the best things in life aren't planned." He'd wink at me, and for a moment, the weight of being unwanted would lift from my small shoulders. With Sarah away at college, I thought things might change at home. Maybe my parents would finally see me, the daughter who remained. I couldn't have been more wrong. "Madison," my mother's voice reached me before I could even drop my backpack after school. "The house needs cleaning. Start with the bathrooms." What had once been Sarah's chores now became mine, along with a host of new responsibilities. The washing machine became my constant companion, and I learned all its quirks and settings by heart. The housework seemed endless. "You live here, you need to contribute," my father would say whenever I showed the slightest hesitation. "Your sister always did her part." By the time I was 14, I had graduated from cleaning to cooking. It wasn't a gradual transition. One day, my mother simply stopped making dinner. "You're old enough now," she announced one morning. "We expect dinner ready when we get home from work." That first night, I made spaghetti. It was slightly overcooked, but edible. My parents ate in silence, then my father looked up from his plate. "Tomorrow, try something with chicken," he said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a suggestion. My only escape was dreaming about college. Every night, after finishing the dishes, I'd retreat to my room and browse university websites. I'd imagine myself walking across different campuses, far away from the endless chores and cold silences. Then, when I was 16, Sarah came home with news that changed everything. She bounced through the front door one Sunday afternoon, dragging a tall, well-dressed man behind her. "Mom, Dad," she squealed. "This is James. We're engaged." You'd think someone had just announced they'd won the lottery. My parents literally jumped from their seats, my mother crying tears of joy. My father was already pulling out his phone to call relatives. "We'll pay for everything," my mother declared, hugging Sarah. "Our first daughter's wedding has to be perfect." The wedding preparations consumed our house for months. Every conversation revolved around flowers, venues, and guest lists. Money seemed to flow like water: designer dress, premium vendors, top-tier everything. My grandparents attended the wedding but seemed uncomfortable with the extravagance. I caught my grandmother frowning at the ice sculpture that probably cost more than a semester of college tuition. Grandfather just shook his head at the champagne fountain, but they kept their thoughts to themselves. 2 years later, I sat at our dinner table, 3 college acceptance letters spread before me. After years of playing Cinderella while maintaining straight A's, I'd been accepted to all my top choices. My heart raced as I told my parents the good news. "That's nice," my mother said, not looking up from her plate. "But we can't pay for it. We spent all our savings on your sister's wedding, even took out a loan for it. There's nothing left for college." "But, you paid for Sarah's college," I stammered. "That was different," my mother replied. "We saw potential in her." The silence at the dinner table was deafening after my mother's words about potential. I sat there, acceptance letters suddenly feeling heavy in my hands, as my parents continued eating as if they hadn't just shattered my dreams. "You should get a job," my father said between bites. "Save up some money, take out a student loan. That's what responsible adults do." I left the table without being excused, something I'd never dared to do before. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called my grandmother. Within minutes, I was walking through their familiar front door, tears streaming down my face. "Oh, sweetheart," my grandmother pulled me into a hug while I told them everything between sobs. My grandfather's face grew stern as he listened, but there was a glimmer in his eyes that I couldn't quite read. When I finished, they exchanged a knowing look. "Madison," my grandfather said, taking my hand, "we've been expecting something like this." "What do you mean?" "We've watched how they've treated you all these years," my grandmother explained, "how they spent money on Sarah's education, her wedding. We knew they might do this to you." My grandfather stood up and walked to his study. When he returned, he was holding a folder. "We've been saving for your education since the day you were born," he said, opening the folder to reveal bank statements. "You can choose any of those 3 colleges. We've got you covered." That night, I went home and packed my things. Not everything, just what I needed. My parents were watching TV downstairs and barely looked up when I told them I was moving in with my grandparents. "Whatever you think is best," my mother said, her eyes never leaving the screen. Was that relief I heard in her voice? The next few weeks were a blur of college preparations. I chose to study financial analysis. Somehow, watching my parents' mismanagement of money had sparked an interest in doing things the right way. My grandparents helped me with every detail, from filling out forms to buying supplies. When I finally started classes that fall, it felt like stepping into a new world. The material was challenging, but I loved every minute of it. Each class felt like a step away from my old life and toward something better. My professors noticed my enthusiasm, and soon I was staying after class to discuss complex financial concepts. For the first time in my life, someone besides my grandparents saw potential in me, real potential. My second year of college was in full swing when my grandmother called with some interesting news about Sarah. "Your sister's having trouble," she said during one of our weekly calls. "Her marketing career isn't taking off like she hoped, and James can't seem to hold down a job. They're constantly asking your parents for money." I wasn't surprised when she told me they were getting it. "Your mother emptied her retirement account last month to help them with rent," my grandmother sighed. "They just can't say no to her." A year later, the situation got worse. Sarah and James couldn't make rent anymore, even with our parents' help. They moved back into my old bedroom, the one I'd spent years keeping spotlessly clean. The irony wasn't lost on me. Meanwhile, I was thriving. My professors had helped me land internships at prestigious financial firms, where I discovered I had a real talent for solving complex financial puzzles. Each challenging project made me more certain I'd chosen the right path. "You've got a natural instinct for this," my supervisor at Morgan Stanley told me during my performance review. "We'd love to have you back next summer." I kept my head down and focused on my studies, barely thinking about my family except during calls with my grandparents. But when I visited them during my senior year, I knew something was wrong the moment I walked through their door. My grandmother's usual warm smile seemed forced, and my grandfather, usually quick with a joke, sat quietly in his armchair. The house felt heavy with unspoken words. "What's wrong?" I asked over dinner, watching them push food around their plates. "And don't tell me it's nothing. I know you both too well." They exchanged a look I'd seen too many times before, the one that meant they were trying to protect me from something. Finally, my grandfather spoke. "Your parents came to see us last week," he said, his voice unusually tired. "They wanted their inheritance early." "What do you mean?" I put down my fork. "They're in trouble with the banks," my grandmother explained. "Multiple loans, credit card debt. They said they needed $200,000 to avoid bankruptcy." "And you gave it to them?" I couldn't keep the anger from my voice. My grandfather nodded. We had to, Madison. They're still our daughter and son-in-law, despite everything. It was most of our savings, but... Most of your savings? I was furious. After everything they've done? After how they keep enabling Sarah's irresponsible behavior? After how they treated me? Sweetheart, my grandmother reached across the table to take my hand. We know you're angry, but what's done is done. We'll be fine. But I kept getting angry. My parents, who'd never had money for my education, who'd treated me like a servant, had the audacity to demand money from the only people who'd ever truly cared for me. All because they couldn't say no to Sarah and couldn't manage their own finances. My hard work paid off after graduation. With glowing recommendations from my professors and impressive internship experiences, I landed a position at one of the top financial firms in the city. The starting salary was more than I'd ever dreamed of making. I found a modest one-bedroom apartment, nothing fancy but clean and safe. Every morning, I'd wake up grateful that I didn't have to cook breakfast for anyone but myself. My career flourished as I threw myself into each new challenge, earning promotions and bonuses that my younger self couldn't have imagined. Within a few years, I had enough saved for a down payment on my own place. The day I signed the mortgage papers, I couldn't help but think of my parents and Sarah, who'd never managed their money well enough to buy property. Not that they knew about my success, we hadn't spoken in years. Then came the call that changed everything. My grandfather had suffered a massive heart attack. By the time I reached the hospital, he was gone. My grandmother, who'd been by his side for over 50 years, seemed to lose her spark after that. Less than 2 months later, she followed him. I was arranging my grandmother's funeral when I heard a familiar voice behind me at the funeral home. Madison? Do you want some help with the arrangements? I turned to find my mother standing there, looking older and more tired than I remembered. Part of me wanted to tell her to leave, but something in her expression made me hesitate. Sure, I heard myself say. That would be nice. Over the next few days, as we planned the service, my parents began to open up. They were struggling, they admitted. Retirement hadn't been kind to them financially. We barely make ends meet, my father confessed one afternoon while we were picking out flowers. And with Sarah's twins. Twins? This was news to me. Yes, 4-year-olds, my mother jumped in. Such beautiful boys, but they need so much. Sarah and James still can't manage on their own, so we help where we can. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Some things never changed. A week after we laid my grandmother to rest, we gathered in a wood-paneled office for the reading of the will. I sat across from my parents, with Sarah and James slouched in chairs beside them. The room smelled of old papers and furniture polish, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. The notary, Mr. Patterson, adjusted his glasses and began reading in a monotone voice. I expected the usual legal jargon, but what came next made everyone sit up straight. To our beloved granddaughter, Madison, he read, "We leave our house at 1542 Maple Street and the sum of $150,000. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's mouth fell open, and my mother gripped my father's arm so hard her knuckles turned white. Mr. Patterson cleared his throat and continued, and a personal note from Mr. Henderson to his daughter, Margaret. He looked at my mother. The note reads, "Margaret, remember that we gave you $200,000 when you needed it most. This is our final decision, and we trust you will respect it as we respected your needs then." My mother's face flushed red, then pale. My father stared at the floor, while Sarah and James exchanged worried glances. After the notary finished and gathered his papers, my parents approached me in the parking lot. The confident demeanor they'd shown during the funeral arrangements was gone, replaced by something almost desperate. "Madison, honey," my mother began, her voice trembling, "you have to understand, we always thought we'd inherit the house. We were counting on it. We're struggling," my father added, running his hand through his gray hair. "The mortgage, Sarah's family's expenses, we could really use the house. I looked at them both, remembering all the years of neglect, the constant reminders that I wasn't wanted, the refusal to help with my education. "No," I said firmly. "The house is mine. That's what Grandma and Grandpa wanted." They continued pleading, following me to my car, but I stood firm. Sarah joined in too, talking about how her boys needed a yard to play in, but I simply got in my car and drove away. A week later, my phone rang. It was my mother, asking me to come over for dinner. Something in her voice sounded different, humbled, perhaps. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Pulling up to my childhood home was like stepping back in time, except everything looked shabbier than I remembered. The paint was peeling, the gutters sagged, and the once pristine lawn was patchy and overgrown. Inside, the house was crowded but clean. Sarah's twins, Tommy and Jake, ran circles around the living room while James half-heartedly told them to settle down. The boys were cute, they had Sarah's eyes and James's curly hair. "Madison," my mother smiled, pulling me into an awkward hug. "We made your favorite, pot roast." "That's not my favorite," I said automatically. "That's Sarah's favorite." An uncomfortable silence followed, broken by my father clearing his throat. "Well, why don't you tell us what your favorite food is? We'd love to know." And surprisingly, they seemed genuinely interested. Over dinner, they asked about my job, my apartment, my hobbies. They actually listened when I talked about my work in finance, though I could tell most of it went over their heads. That dinner led to another, then another. Soon, I was joining them for holidays, bringing gifts for the twins, even helping Sarah with their homework sometimes. When they mentioned the house needed repairs, I found myself offering to help. I paid for a new roof, fixed the heating system, repainted the exterior. Each time I wrote a check, my parents would tear up with gratitude. "You're too good to us," my mother would say, hugging me. "We don't deserve this." You're right, I would think, but never say it aloud. Because despite everything, despite all the years of hurt and neglect, some small part of me still wanted to believe people could change. The years passed, and my career continued to flourish. Each promotion brought new opportunities, and my investment portfolio grew substantially. Meanwhile, my relationship with my parents seemed to strengthen. They were getting older, both were over 70 now, and I found myself wanting to do something meaningful for them. "I'd been thinking," I said during one of our Sunday dinners, watching my father struggle up from his chair. "This house isn't really suitable for you anymore. I want to buy you a new house. Something single-story, with a nice garden, but easier to maintain. Something that would be comfortable for your retirement years." Their reactions surprised me, actual tears of joy. We spent the next few weeks house hunting together, and finally found the perfect place, a beautiful ranch-style home in a quiet neighborhood, with wide doorways and no stairs. After closing my checkbook, my parents couldn't stop talking about how excited they were. "We need to have a proper housewarming party," my father declared. "Let us arrange everything. It's the least we can do." "That would be lovely," I agreed, planning to present them with the deed during the celebration. "Just let me know when." Weeks passed. I was busy with work, but I kept expecting an invitation. When nothing came, I started asking about the date. "Oh, we're still planning," my mother would say. "You know how these things take time." "We want it to be perfect," my father would add. "We'll let you know soon." Something about their vague responses niggled at me. One evening, after another deflecting phone call from my mother, I found myself typing Sarah's name into Facebook. I hadn't looked at her profile in years, we weren't connected on any social media. There it was, posted just hours ago, "So excited for Mom and Dad's housewarming party this Saturday. The new house is gorgeous, can't wait to celebrate with everyone." The post had dozens of comments from relatives and friends, all confirming their attendance. Photos showed decorations being set up, caterers being booked. This wasn't a last-minute gathering, this had been planned for weeks. My hands shaking slightly, I called my mother. "Hi Mom," I kept my voice casual. "Just checking in about the housewarming party. have you set a date yet?" "Oh honey, not yet," she replied smoothly. "Probably in a couple of weeks. We're still working out the details. We want everyone to be able to come." Everyone except me, apparently. That Saturday, I parked my car a block away from the house I'd bought. Music and laughter drifted through the evening air. Through the large front windows, I could see dozens of people milling about, relatives I recognized, friends of my parents, Sarah's social circle. The front door was unlocked. Of course it was. They were expecting everyone except the person who actually owned the house. I slipped in quietly, following the sound of my father's voice, to the living room. "And after all these years of hard work, we finally did it," he was saying to a group of attentive listeners. "Bought our dream home. Don't forget about Sarah," my mother added proudly. "She helped so much with the down payment. Such a wonderful daughter. Always taking care of her parents," someone commented. "Unlike some people," my mother said pointedly. "You know, our younger daughter hasn't helped us at all. Probably too busy with her career to care about family." I stood in the doorway, heat rising to my face as I watched this performance. Sarah beamed beside them, her 7-year-old twins running between the guests in the house I'd bought. "Actually," I said loudly, making everyone jump, "I think you've got that backwards." The color drained from my parents' faces. Guests turned to stare at me, whispers rippling through the crowd. "Madison," my father recovered first, his smile tight. "What a surprise." "I'm sure it is," I replied, stepping into the room. "Especially since you forgot to invite me to the housewarming party for the house I bought." Dead silence fell over the room. Sarah's husband suddenly became very interested in his shoes. "Well," my mother's voice had an edge to it, "what's done is done. You bought it, yes, but it's ours now. You can't expect eternal gratitude." "That's right," my father added, gaining confidence. "And frankly, you're not welcome here. This is a family gathering. And Sarah and her family will be living here too," my mother announced. "They've already sold their house. It's all arranged." I couldn't help but laugh, a cold, harsh sound that made several guests step back. Reaching into my bag, I pulled out a folder. "You seem to be confused about something," I said, opening the folder to reveal the deed and ownership papers. "This house belongs to me. I never signed it over to you. I was planning to give it to you tonight, at what I thought would be a proper housewarming party." My mother's face went from pale to ashen. My father started to sputter. "And now?" I turned to address the stunned guests. "Now, I'd like everyone to leave. This is my house, and the party's over." "You can't do this," my mother's voice rose to a shriek. "We're your parents." "No," I said quietly. "You're just the people who gave birth to me. My real parents, my grandparents, taught me that family means more than blood. They also taught me about finances, which is why I own this house and you don't." They left in tears, my parents, Sarah, James, the twins, and all their guests. I watched from the front porch as they drove away, one by one, until the street was empty. After a few weeks, I learned they'd used the money from selling their own house to buy an apartment. Sarah, James, and the twins moved in with them. They tried calling me for weeks, but I blocked their numbers, their emails, their social media accounts. The house? I sold it a month later and put the money in my account. Someday, I'll have my own children, and I promised myself they'll never have to earn my love or compete for my attention. Unlike my parents, I'll love my children equally and unconditionally, the way my grandparents loved me. My name is Amanda, and for as long as I can remember, my sister Sarah was the golden child. She was 3 years younger than me, but somehow she always came first in our parents' eyes. Don't get me wrong, they didn't neglect me entirely. They just preferred her. When I made the debate team, they nodded and smiled. When Sarah joined the cheerleading squad, they threw a party. When I needed new clothes, we went to the outlet mall. When Sarah wanted a new wardrobe, it was a weekend shopping spree at the fancy stores downtown. Dad wasn't much different. Every Saturday, he'd take Sarah to the park, buy her ice cream, and spend hours pushing her on the swings. I'd tag along sometimes, walking a few steps behind them, watching their matching dark hair bounce as they laughed at inside jokes I wasn't part of. Sarah wasn't cruel about it, which almost made it worse. She never rubbed it in my face or tried to make me feel bad. She was just there, soaking up all the attention like a pretty little sponge, while I learned to thrive in the shadows. Our relationship was comfortable. Not close, exactly, but not hostile either. We existed in a careful balance, like two planets orbiting the same sun, never colliding but never quite connecting either. I threw myself into my studies, finding validation in academic achievement that I couldn't get at home. While Sarah was content to coast by on her charm and our parents' indulgence, I worked my ass off. Every A+, every academic award, every teacher's praise, became a brick in the wall I built around my heart. Amanda's so mature for her age, teachers would tell my parents at conferences. Such a dedicated student. My parents would smile politely, then rush home to help Sarah with her homework or console her over some minor social drama. It was just the way things were, and I convinced myself I was okay with it. Looking back now, I should have seen the signs. The way Sarah's smile would tighten when I achieved something she couldn't. The flash of resentment in her eyes when our parents actually paid attention to me. The subtle way she'd redirect conversations to herself whenever I was in the spotlight. But I was too busy trying to prove myself, too focused on being the perfect daughter even if I could never be the favorite one. I thought if I just worked hard enough, achieved enough, maybe one day they'd see me, really see me, for who I was. College was my escape. Finally, a place where hard work actually meant something, where being the responsible one was an asset rather than a consolation prize. I got into State University with a partial scholarship. All those straight A's finally paid off. I threw myself into campus life with the same intensity I'd applied to high school. While other freshmen were struggling to adjust, I was thriving. I joined the business club, made the dean's list, and landed an internship at Preston and Associates, one of the top financial firms in the city. "You're a natural," my supervisor told me during my internship evaluation. "We'd love to have you join us full-time after graduation." I practically floated home that day. For once, everything was falling into place according to my plans, not anyone else's expectations. Meanwhile, Sarah started college 3 years after me. Mom and Dad paid her full tuition, set her up in a fancy apartment near campus, and gave her a monthly allowance that was more than I made at my part-time job. "Your sister needs to focus on the college experience," Dad explained when I pointed out the disparity. "You're different, you actually enjoy studying." He wasn't wrong. While I was building my future, Sarah was building her social media following. Her Instagram was full of party photos and spring break adventures. Every time I visited home, she had a new story about some crazy night out. "You should come party with us sometime," she'd say, knowing full well I was too busy with my internship and studies to join her. After graduation, Preston and Associates made good on their offer. I started as a junior analyst and rented a small but decent apartment downtown. It wasn't much, but it was mine, earned with my own hard work. That's where I met James. He was the financial director, tall, clean-cut, with kind eyes and a quiet confidence that made my heart skip. We started running into each other in the break room, then at company happy hours, and finally, he asked me to dinner. When he proposed 6 months later, I was over the moon. He did it properly, down on one knee at our favorite restaurant, with a ring that must have cost him at least 3 months' salary. I couldn't wait to tell my family. We arranged a dinner at my parents' house, and Sarah, who'd recently graduated and moved back home, would be there too. She'd been working some entry-level marketing job, though from her social media, it seemed like she spent more time at happy hours than at her desk. The dinner started well enough. Mom made her famous pot roast, Dad opened his best wine, and James charmed them all with stories about his work and plans for the future. "Amanda really lucked out with you," Mom gushed, touching James's arm. "Such a responsible young man." They make such a perfect couple, Dad agreed, beaming at us. When's the wedding? For once, all the attention was on me, and it felt amazing. James squeezed my hand under the table as my parents peppered us with questions about wedding venues and dates. But across the table, Sarah sat picking at her food, her face growing darker with each passing minute. I caught her staring at my engagement ring, her lips pressed into a thin line. Every time James spoke, she would roll her eyes slightly or shift uncomfortably in her chair. James and I decided not to rush into the wedding. We started looking at venues on weekends, discussing color schemes over dinner, and dreaming about our future together. I'd never been happier. That all changed on a Tuesday evening. I remember it was Tuesday because I'd just finished my weekly video call with my wedding planner. I was still in my work clothes when James knocked on my door. Something was off. He usually texted before coming over, and his face was like a thundercloud. "We need to talk," he said, pushing past me into the apartment. His voice was cold, nothing like the warm, gentle tone I was used to. "What's wrong?" I asked, my stomach already knotting with anxiety. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling. "Care to explain these?" My heart stopped as he showed me photo after photo. There I was, or someone who looked like me, in compromising positions with different men. Screenshots of explicit text conversations filled his screen, all allegedly from me to various guys. "James, that's not. I never." My voice shook as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. "These are fake. I've never cheated on you." "Fake?" He laughed bitterly. "Your own sister sent these to me." "So you're saying Sarah made all this up? Created fake photos and messages just to break us up? Why would she do that?" "I don't know why she'd do this, but James, please, look at my phone." I scrambled to grab it from the coffee table. "Check everything. There's nothing like this on there. I've never cheated on you." "Don't bother," he cut me off, stepping back when I tried to hand him my phone. "I trusted you, Amanda. I thought you were different. But you're just like all the others, a lying, cheating traitor." "James, please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "You know me. You know I wouldn't do this." But his eyes were cold and distant. "We're done. Don't try to contact me again." The door slammed behind him with a finality that shattered my world. I tried calling him immediately, straight to voicemail. Text messages wouldn't go through. Email bounced back. He'd blocked me everywhere. I collapsed onto my couch, my whole body shaking with sobs. How could this be happening? How could he believe I would cheat on him? And Sarah, my own sister, had done this to me? The hours blurred together as I cried until I had no tears left. My phone kept lighting up with concerned messages from friends and coworkers. Apparently, James had already started spreading the word about my infidelity. After crying myself to sleep, I woke up the next morning with one purpose: confronting Sarah. My hand shook as I dialed her number, half expecting her to ignore the call. But she picked up on the second ring. "Well, if it isn't my cheating sister," she answered, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "Why did you do it?" My voice cracked. "Why would you fake those photos and messages?" She laughed. Actually laughed. The sound made my blood run cold. "Oh, come on, Amanda. Did you really think I'd let you have your perfect little happily ever after? You, married to a successful, handsome guy like James? Please. What are you talking about? You don't deserve him." Her voice suddenly turned vicious. "You don't deserve any of it. The perfect job, the perfect fiancé. Who do you think you are?" I felt like I'd been slapped. "Sarah, we're sisters." "Sisters?" she sneered. "Please. You're nothing but second best, Amanda. You always have been, and you always will be. Did you really think you'd get to marry someone like James before me? That's not how this works." In that moment, 25 years of sisterhood shattered. All those memories, the shared rooms, the whispered secrets, the forced smiles at family gatherings, they all took on a different meaning. Every eye roll, every backhanded compliment, every moment of tension suddenly made sense. "You've been jealous of me this whole time," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a truck. "Jealous?" She laughed again. "Don't flatter yourself. I'm better than you in every way. I just couldn't stand watching you play house with James when we all know you don't deserve him." I drove to my parents' house that afternoon, desperate for support. Surely they'd believe me. Surely they'd see what Sarah had done. I was wrong. "Amanda, honey," Mom said, shaking her head. "Why are you trying to blame your sister for your mistakes?" "But I didn't make any mistakes," I practically shouted. "Sarah faked everything. She admitted it to me." Dad crossed his arms. "Your sister would never do something like that. Stop trying to shift the blame. If you cheated on James, you need to own up to it." I left their house in a daze. Once again, Sarah was the golden child who could do no wrong, and I was the screw-up who couldn't be trusted. But life wasn't done kicking me while I was down. The next morning, I walked into work only to find my access card denied. Security escorted me to HR, where a sympathetic-looking woman handed me my termination papers. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, glancing around to make sure no one could hear. "James pushed for immediate termination. He said he couldn't work in the same building as, well." I didn't even finish reading the paperwork. I just signed it, packed up my desk, and left with my head held high, at least until I got to my car, where I broke down completely. 3 days later, my best friend Jenny called. "Amanda, I don't know how to tell you this, but Sarah and James are dating. She's been posting pictures of them together all over Instagram. She's saying she's been helping him heal after your betrayal." I hung up without responding and threw my phone across the room. In the span of a week, I'd lost my fiancé, my job, my family's trust, and now my sister was dating the man she'd helped me lose. Depression hit me like a ton of bricks. For a month, I barely left my apartment except to buy groceries. Thank God I'd been saving for the wedding, at least I could afford to wallow in my misery without worrying about rent. I spent my days in a fog, alternating between crying and staring blankly at Netflix shows I couldn't focus on. My phone stayed off most of the time. I couldn't bear to see more photos of Sarah and James together, couldn't stomach another well-meaning message from friends asking if I was okay. Then one night, around 3 a.m., I shot up in bed with sudden clarity. The fog lifted, and for the first time in weeks, I could think straight. I didn't want to die, I wanted revenge. Not the petty kind with drunk texts or social media drama. No, I wanted to expose Sarah for who she really was, to make everyone see the snake hiding behind that innocent smile. It was like someone had flipped a switch in my brain. The next morning, I showered for the first time in days, put on my best suit, and started job hunting. Within 2 weeks, I landed a position at Morrison Financial, a bigger firm than Preston and Associates, with better benefits and a corner office. I even started visiting my parents again. "I'm doing better now," I'd tell them with a practiced smile. "Sometimes things fall apart so better things can come together." They ate it up, relieved to see their older daughter moving on so maturely. I sat through family dinners, nodding politely when Sarah and James would show up hand in hand. He'd avoid looking at me directly, while Sarah would shoot me these little smirks when no one else was watching. "James and I are thinking about getting engaged," she announced at one such dinner, watching me carefully for a reaction. I just smiled and asked to pass the potatoes. 2 years passed this way. I built my career, making a name for myself in the industry. I went on a few dates, though nothing serious. And I waited. Patience had always been my strong suit. Then came my opportunity. Sarah was having Sunday dinner at our parents' house, without James, who was on a business trip. She'd left her phone on the kitchen counter while helping Mom with dessert. I knew her passwords. She'd always been careless about security, leaving sticky notes with her login information scattered around her desk at our parents' house. It took less than a minute to get into her phone. And there it was, months of messages with someone named Mike. Hundreds of texts, dozens of photos that would make James's blood boil. God, Jay is so boring, one message read. All he talks about is work and investments. At least he's loaded. Can't wait to see you tomorrow, baby, another said. Jay's credit card is buying us a nice hotel room. My hands shook as I forwarded everything to my email, the messages, the photos, the hotel receipts. I even found Mike's address in their chat history. They weren't even trying to be careful. Getting the video evidence was almost too easy. Mike's house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, perfect for discreet surveillance. I spent a few evenings parked across the street in a rental car, my phone camera ready. Sarah wasn't exactly subtle about her afternoon visits. She'd pull up in the Mercedes James had bought her, practically skipping to Mike's front door. Their passionate embraces on the doorstep gave me all the footage I needed. Baby, I missed you, she'd coo loud enough for my phone's microphone to pick up. James is so boring compared to you. I collected 3 weeks worth of videos. Sarah and Mike making out against his car. Sarah sneaking out of his house at odd hours. The two of them laughing over what looked like expensive champagne on his patio, probably paid for with James's credit card. Then came the engagement party. Sarah insisted on having it at our parents' house. It's more intimate, she'd said, though really she just wanted to show off to the whole family. James had proposed with a ring twice the size of the one he'd given me. The house was packed with relatives, friends, and James's entire family. Sarah held court in the living room, showing off her ring to anyone who'd look. Mom and Dad beamed with pride, while James's parents kept commenting on what a perfect couple they made. I'd like to make a toast, I announced, standing up during a lull in the conversation. All eyes turned to me. Sarah shot me that superior look I'd grown so used to. The same look she'd given me 2 years ago, when she'd stolen my fiancé. Poor thing, probably thought I was about to give some gracious speech about being happy for them. I have something to share with everyone, I continued, connecting my phone to the TV. A little engagement present, you might say. The first text messages appeared on the screen. Sarah's face went white. What is this? James stood up, squinting at the messages. Oh, just some conversations between your fiancé and her boyfriend Mike, I said calmly. There's quite a lot of them. They particularly enjoy discussing how boring you are, James. But hey, at least you're rich, right? That's not. Sarah stammered. And here's some video evidence, in case anyone has doubts. I played the clips one by one. Sarah and Mike kissing. Sarah leaving his house at midnight. Sarah laughing about James while sipping expensive wine. The room erupted into chaos. James was on his feet, roaring at Sarah. His parents were shouting about disgrace and scandal. Our relatives were whispering and pointing. You crazy bastard, Sarah screamed at me. How could you do this? Funny, I replied. That's exactly what I wanted to ask you 2 years ago. Mom collapsed onto the couch, sobbing. Dad just stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I didn't stick around for the aftermath. I gathered my things, walked to my car, and drove home in perfect silence. Inside my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my balcony, watching the city lights twinkle. For the first time in 2 years, I felt completely at peace. My phone rang at 7 a.m. the next morning. Mom's name flashed on the screen. How could you humiliate your sister like that? She screamed, before I could even say hello. James called off the engagement. She's devastated. You need to fix this right now. Fix what exactly? I asked calmly. The fact that she cheated? The fact that she got caught? Or maybe you want me to fix the fact that she's finally facing consequences for her actions? She's your sister. Dad's voice came on the line, they had me on speaker. Family protects family. You will fix this, or we'll. I cut him off. Or you'll what? Take her side again? Go ahead, I'm used to it. I hung up and blocked their numbers. I needed coffee before dealing with any more family drama. But I hadn't even finished my first cup when someone started pounding on my apartment door. "Open up, you damned bastard," Sarah's voice echoed through the hallway. I took my time walking to the door, unlocked it, and stepped back as she burst in. "You ruined everything," she screamed, mascara running down her face. "You ruined my life." "Karma's a bitch, isn't it?" I took another sip of coffee. "I'm going to make you pay for this." She grabbed a framed photo from my wall and threw it at me. I dodged it easily. "Like you made me pay 2 years ago?" I asked quietly. "When you fabricated evidence of me cheating? When you destroyed my relationship? When you took James for yourself?" She froze, realization dawning on her face. You planned this. All of it. The whole time." 2 years, I confirmed. 2 years of watching and waiting. 2 years of playing the forgiving sister. 2 years of knowing that sooner or later, you'd show your true colors. "You're insane," she whispered. "No, Sarah, I'm patient. And unlike you, I only needed real evidence to get my revenge." She ran from my apartment like she'd seen a ghost. The weeks that followed were a parade of guilt-tripping messages from my parents. Sarah had lost her job due to emotional distress. She wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping. She'd moved back home and spent her days crying in her old bedroom. "You've destroyed your sister," Mom texted. "Are you happy now?" I didn't respond. What was there to say? Dad tried a different approach. "If you don't make this right, you're out of the will. Is that what you want?" I finally replied to that one, "Do whatever you want with your money." I've already got what I wanted, the truth. They didn't like that answer much. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care what they thought about me. While my personal life had been a soap opera, my career was soaring. Morrison Financial promoted me to senior director, complete with a corner office and a substantial raise. Sarah, meanwhile, hit rock bottom. After losing her marketing job, she moved back in with our parents. That's when the drinking started, wine with breakfast, vodka for lunch, whatever she could get her hands on. It was during one of her drunken episodes that the truth finally came out. Mom told me about it later, how Sarah had been sprawled on the couch, halfway through a bottle of wine, when she started rambling. I showed him those pictures she'd slurred. Made them all up, found some girl who looked like Amanda, got someone to help me fake the texts. She didn't deserve him anyway. I deserved him more. Mom and Dad sat there in stunned silence as their perfect younger daughter continued her drunken confession, spilling every detail about how she'd orchestrated my downfall. 2 years of lies came crashing down in one wine-soaked evening. Dad called me the next day. His voice was thick with emotion. "Amanda, we need to talk. Can you come over?" I found them both in the living room, looking like they'd aged 10 years overnight. Mom couldn't even look me in the eye. "We were wrong," Dad said simply. "About everything. We'd been wrong for a very long time." Mom burst into tears. "How could we not have seen it? How could we have been so blind?" "We failed you," Dad continued. "Not just about James, but your whole life. We always favored Sarah, always made excuses for her. We let her get away with destroying your happiness because we couldn't believe she was capable of such cruelty. It was the apology I'd waited my whole life to hear. But instead of feeling triumphant, I just felt tired." Dad cleared his throat. "I'd been thinking, maybe we should try family therapy. The 3 of us. To work through everything. So we did. Every Tuesday evening, we sat in Dr. Marshall's office, unpacking decades of favoritism, resentment, and misplaced trust. It wasn't easy, there were tears, shouting matches, weeks of awkward silence. But slowly, gradually, things began to change. As for Sarah, my parents finally did what they should have done years ago, they cut her off. They gave her enough money for a security deposit and first month's rent on an apartment, telling her she could come back when she got help and showed genuine remorse for her actions. Last I heard, she's working as a receptionist somewhere downtown and living in a studio apartment. She sends mom and dad messages sometimes, but they're staying firm on their boundaries. James reached out eventually. My parents had told him everything, Sarah's confession, the years of manipulation, all of it. He asked to meet for coffee. I should have believed you, he said, looking older and tired. I should have at least listened to your side. I know it's probably too late, but maybe we could try again? I studied his face, the face I'd once thought I'd wake up to every morning for the rest of my life. I felt nothing. No, I said gently. I forgive you, James. But I don't love you anymore. I'm not the same person I was 2 years ago. These days, my life is quieter. I have dinner with mom and dad every Sunday. We're not perfect, there are still moments of tension, old habits that die hard. But we're trying, and that's more than we ever did before. I don't regret exposing Sarah. Some might call it revenge, but I call it justice. She made her choices, and now she's living with the consequences. As for me, I'm exactly where I want to be. My career is thriving, I have my own place, and for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I'm second best to anyone. I never thought I'd be living alone in this house at 62. Running my fingers along the smooth wooden banister as I climb the stairs each evening, I can't help but think about all the generations of my family who've done the same. This house on Maple Street has been in my family for over a century, and I've called it home for most of my life. My name is Caroline Mitchell, and 20 years ago, my husband Robert left me for his 25-year-old secretary. Our son Tommy was only 12 at the time. I remember the day Robert told me he was leaving as if it were yesterday. He stood in our kitchen, not meeting my eyes, fumbling with his wedding ring. I'm sorry, Caroline. I never meant for this to happen, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I just stood there, gripping the kitchen counter until my knuckles turned white. Does she make you happy, Robert? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded, still not looking at me. I'll make sure Tommy is taken care of. I'll pay good alimony. And he did keep that promise, I'll give him that. Every month, without fail, the money came in. I saved every penny of it for Tommy's college fund, working extra hours at the marketing firm to cover our daily expenses. The house, thank goodness, was already paid for, my grandmother's final gift to me. This house has been my anchor through everything. Film crews even used it once for a period piece about the Civil War era, saying it perfectly captured the essence of that time. The producer offered to buy it for an obscene amount of money, but I couldn't sell it. This house isn't just walls and windows, it's my heritage, my story. After Robert left, I threw myself into my work and raising Tommy. Dating? It never felt right. My colleagues would try to set me up, but I always declined. I'm married to my career, I'd joke, but the truth was, I'd lost faith in love. Tommy became my whole world. I made sure he had everything he needed, love, support, guidance. We had our routines, breakfast together every morning, homework at the kitchen table, Sunday movie nights. He graduated with honors and went to a good college, thanks to his father's alimony payments. When Tommy brought home Amy from work last year, I tried to be welcoming. She seemed nice enough, always smiling, complimenting the house, asking about family photos. But something felt off. Maybe it was the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, or how she'd change the subject whenever work came up. Still, I told myself I was just being an overprotective mother. Mom, we're getting married, Tommy announced over dinner one evening. I remember forcing a smile and hugging them both, pushing down the nagging feeling in my gut. I'm so happy for you both, I said, and I meant it. Or at least, I wanted to mean it. The wedding was small but lovely. I sat in the front row, watching my boy promise his life to this woman I barely knew. Robert was there too, with his new family, wife number 2, and their teenage twins. We nodded politely to each other but didn't speak. Everything seemed fine at first. They got an apartment across town, both working at the same tech startup. I'd have them over for dinner sometimes, watching how Amy would inspect everything in the house with those calculating eyes of hers. But I never imagined how quickly things would change, or that my peaceful life was about to be turned upside down. I was at work when I got the call from Tommy. His voice was shaking, and I could tell he'd been crying. "Mom, they're laying off half the company. Both Amy and I, we're being let go." My heart sank. I knew how hard it was to lose a job. I'd seen enough colleagues go through it over my years in marketing. "Take a deep breath, honey. Tell me what you need." "We won't be able to make next month's rent," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Our savings, they're pretty much gone." After some quick calculations, I transferred enough money to cover 3 months of rent for their apartment. It wasn't a small amount, but I had some savings, and this was my son. "This should give you both time to find new jobs," I told him. The weeks that followed were a mix of hope and disappointment. Tommy landed a new position at a smaller company, but the salary was significantly lower than what he'd been making before. Amy, on the other hand, well, I tried not to judge, but her job search seemed half-hearted at best. When I'd visit them, I'd often find her scrolling through social media instead of job listings. Then came another call from Tommy, just as the 3 months were coming to an end. "Mom, I hate to ask this, but is there any chance we could stay with you for a while? Just until things get better?" I looked around my big empty house, thinking of all the unused rooms. "Of course, honey. You know there's always space for you here." They arrived on a Sunday afternoon, their car packed with belongings. As I helped them carry boxes up to Tommy's old room, I couldn't help but notice Amy's eyes darting around the house, taking everything in with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Caroline," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, "your room is just gorgeous. And that home office setup, it would be perfect for our workspace while we're job hunting. Maybe Tommy and I could take that room? It's bigger, and since there are 2 of us." "I'm sorry, Amy," I said firmly but politely, "but that's my personal space. I need my office for work, and I sometimes have to take calls late at night. Tommy's old room is quite spacious, and you'll have plenty of storage in the guest room across the hall." Her face fell, and though she didn't say anything, the look in her eyes sent a chill down my spine. She pursed her lips and turned away, dragging her suitcase up the stairs with more force than necessary. Tommy gave me an apologetic smile. "Thanks for this, Mom. We really appreciate it." Life settled into a new routine, or at least, that's what I tried to tell myself. Every morning, I'd get up at 6, make coffee, and head to work. Tommy would leave around the same time for his new job. And Amy, well, Amy would still be asleep. I tried not to think about it too much during those first few days. "She's probably still applying for jobs online," I told myself. But as the days went by, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Each evening when I returned from work, I'd find her exactly where she'd been that morning, sprawled on my living room couch, phone in hand, surrounded by empty snack bags and coffee mugs. The dishes from her lunch would be piled in the sink, crumbs scattered across my kitchen counter. "How was the job search today?" I'd ask, trying to keep my voice light. "Oh, nothing really suitable for my qualifications," she'd reply without looking up from her phone. 2 weeks passed like this. The house, which I'd always kept immaculate, was starting to show signs of neglect. Dust gathered on the furniture, dishes piled up, and laundry overflowed from the hampers. After a particularly long day at work, I decided it was time for a gentle conversation. We were sitting at dinner, a meal I'd prepared after cleaning the kitchen first. I cleared my throat nervously. "Amy, honey," I began, keeping my voice as gentle as possible, "I was thinking, since you're home during the day, maybe you could help out a bit with the housework? Just until you find a job, of course." The change in her expression was instant. Her fork clattered against the plate, and her eyes welled up with tears. "I knew it," she cried, turning to Tommy. "I knew she'd try to turn me into her maid. Just because I'm temporarily unemployed doesn't mean I should be your mother's servant." I sat there, stunned. "Amy, that's not what I..." You've been looking down on me since day one. She was full on sobbing now. You think I'm not good enough for your precious son or your precious house. Amy, please, I didn't mean, but she was already pushing back her chair, running from the table with dramatic flair. Tommy stood up, his face dark with anger. Mom, I can't believe you'd be so cruel to Amy. She's going through a really tough time right now. After that night, things got even worse. I still did all the cooking and cleaning, while they ordered takeout and left their empty containers wherever they finished eating. Out of habit, or maybe hope, I'd still call them to join me for dinner when I cooked. They'd come down, eat without a word, and leave their dirty dishes on the table. The weeks dragged by, each day feeling longer than the last. The sound of the TV from the living room had become a constant backdrop to my home life, along with the gentle tap-tap of Amy's fingers on her phone screen. I tried to stay out of her way, spending more time at the office than necessary, but the situation weighed heavily on my mind. One morning, during our weekly department meeting, our HR director mentioned they were looking for an office manager. My ears perked up immediately. What's the starting salary? I asked as casually as I could. $45,000 to start, she replied. But there's room for growth. We promote from within whenever possible. I thought about Amy's resume. She had a business degree and had worked in administration before. This could be perfect. I spent my lunch break drafting a careful text to Amy about the position, but then deleted it. This was the kind of news better delivered in person. I left work early that day, my heart light with hope. Maybe this could be the solution to our problems. I found Amy in her usual spot on the couch, scrolling through her phone. A half-eaten bag of chips lay on the coffee table, crumbs scattered across the surface. Amy, I said, trying to keep my voice bright and encouraging. I have some good news. There's an opening at my company for an office manager. It's entry-level, but there's real potential for advancement. The starting salary is decent, and I could drive you to work. We could commute together. She shot up from the couch, sending the chip bag flying. Are you serious right now? An office manager? Do you know what my qualifications are? I just thought. You thought what? That I'd be happy to fetch coffee and organize paper clips? Her voice was rising with each word. I have a business degree. I was a project coordinator. Amy, please, I didn't mean. Oh, I know exactly what you meant. She was practically shrieking now. You think I'm a freeloader. You think I'm lazy. You can't stand the fact that I'm not working, so you're trying to force me into some degrading position. Just then, Tommy walked through the front door, his timing impossibly bad. What's going on? He asked, looking between us. Amy rushed to him, tears streaming down her face. Your mother just insulted me again. She thinks I'm a freeloader. She's trying to force me to take some menial job as an office manager. I stood up, my hands shaking. Tommy, that's not true. I was just trying to help. There's an opening at my company, and I thought. Mom, stop. Tommy's voice cut through the room like a knife. Why do you always have to do this? Why can't you just leave Amy alone? Do what? I asked, genuinely confused. I'm just trying to help. Help? Amy scoffed through her tears. You're trying to humiliate me. She ran up the stairs, her dramatic sobs echoing through the house. Tommy gave me a look of pure disappointment. I never thought you could be so difficult to live with, Mom, he said, shaking his head. You're constantly starting drama. It's like you can't help yourself. He followed his wife upstairs, leaving me standing alone in the living room. I sank back into my chair, my half-finished coffee growing cold in my hands. Starting drama? I whispered to myself, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. In all my 62 years, no one had ever accused me of being dramatic. The days turned into weeks, and I learned to keep my mouth shut about the job situation. The mere mention of work would make Amy's eyes narrow dangerously, so I stopped bringing it up altogether. It was easier that way, even if it meant watching her waste her days away on my couch. Things changed when Tommy got his first big commission at work. Suddenly, Amy was going out more often, returning with shopping bags from expensive boutiques and fresh manicures that probably cost more than our weekly grocery bill. Not once did she think to pick up laundry detergent or paper towels. Those mundane household items remained my responsibility. I kept hoping that with Tommy's improved income, they'd start looking for their own place. Each morning, I'd check the local rental listings on my phone, imagining them finding a nice apartment across town. But they seemed perfectly content to stay put, making themselves more and more at home in my house. One evening, I came home to find Amy excitedly chatting on her phone in my living room. "Oh my God, yes, the house is absolutely perfect for a party," she was saying. "You should see the vintage chandelier in the dining room. It'll look amazing in photos." I set down my briefcase, my stomach already nodding. "What party?" She hung up and turned to Tommy, who had just walked in. "Babe, we should definitely have our anniversary party here. Can you believe it's been almost 2 years? Where exactly are you planning to have this party?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Here, of course." Amy gestured around my living room. "This house is gorgeous, Caroline. All our friends will love it. I'm thinking we could set up the bar in the foyer, and maybe move some furniture around in the living room to create a dance floor." "Shouldn't you have asked me first?" I interrupted, trying to keep my voice level. But Amy was already scrolling through her phone. "We should invite the Hendersons, and maybe that new couple from your office, Tommy. Oh, and we absolutely need to call that catering company we used for New Year's." I turned to Tommy, hoping he'd say something, but he was nodding along with his wife's plans, a smile on his face. Later that evening, I cornered Tommy in the kitchen. "Mom, I know what you're going to say," he started, "but it would mean so much to Amy. She's been feeling down lately, and this would really lift her spirits. This is my house, Tommy. You can't just decide to throw a party here without asking me first." "Please, Mom?" He gave me that look, the same one he used to give me when he wanted extra dessert as a child. "I promise we'll take care of everything. I'll even hire a cleaning service to come in afterward. You won't have to lift a finger." I stood there, looking at my son, this man who used to be the considerate boy I raised, and felt my resolve crumbling. "Fine," I sighed, already knowing I'd regret this decision. "But I want everything back in its proper place afterward." "Thanks, Mom. You're the best." He hugged me quickly and bounded up the stairs to tell Amy the good news. The week leading up to the party was a whirlwind of activity, none of which I was included in. Amy took over my house like a general, planning a military campaign. Delivery trucks came and went, bringing everything from fancy tablecloths to crystal champagne flutes. She rearranged my furniture without asking, pushing my favorite reading chair into a corner to make room for a makeshift dance floor. I kept my distance, retreating to my office whenever possible. Still, I couldn't help but overhear her endless phone conversations about appetizer selections and wine choices. My grandmother's antique vase was moved to make room for elaborate flower arrangements, and my family photos were taken down to be replaced with string lights and paper lanterns. Friday afternoon, I left work early. I had even bought a new dress for the occasion, nothing too fancy, just a simple navy blue cocktail dress that I thought would be appropriate. As I pulled into my driveway, I could see cars already lining the street. I took a deep breath and walked up to my own front door. Inside, the house was barely recognizable. The furniture had been pushed against the walls, creating an open space in the center where people were already dancing. The air was thick with the smell of catering food and expensive perfume. Amy spotted me from across the room. She was wearing a short silver dress that caught the light from the newly installed party lights, her hair and makeup professionally done. She excused herself from the group she was talking to and walked over to me, her face fixed in an artificial smile. "Caroline," she said, her voice sickly sweet but loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I thought you'd be gone by now." I blinked in confusion. "Gone? Why would I be gone?" "Oh." She tilted her head, her smile never wavering. "I guess I forgot to mention, This party is really just for our friends. You know, young people? I assumed you'd make other arrangements for the evening. Maybe get a hotel room? I stood there, stunned, as a few of her friends nearby giggled into their champagne glasses. This is my house, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yes, and you've been so generous letting us use it, Amy said, patting my arm condescendingly. But you have to understand, having someone's mom at an anniversary party is kind of a buzzkill. I looked past her to Tommy, who was standing nearby, watching this exchange. Surely he wouldn't allow this. Surely he would step in and defend me. Mom, he said, walking over. Amy's right. This is really more of a young people's party. It might be better if you weren't here. In that moment, something inside me, something that had been stretching thinner and thinner over the past months, finally snapped. Without a word, I turned and walked up the stairs. Behind me, I could hear Amy's smug voice. See? I knew she'd be reasonable about this. She's probably just gone to pack an overnight bag. I entered Tommy's old room, their room now, and pulled their suitcases from under the bed. My hands were steady as I began emptying drawers, folding nothing, just throwing their clothes into the bags. Designer dresses, expensive suits, all the things they'd bought with Tommy's new salary, into the suitcases they went. I stripped the bed, wrapped their toiletries in a towel, and added those too. The music thumped below as I dragged the heavy suitcases down the stairs, one in each hand. The sound of them bumping against each step drew everyone's attention. The crowd parted as I entered the living room, faces turning from their conversations to watch the scene unfold. Mom? Tommy's voice cracked. What are you doing? I dropped the suitcases in the middle of the makeshift dance floor. You're leaving, now. The party's over. Amy's face contorted with rage. What the hell do you think you're doing? She screamed. You can't do this. This is my house, I said, my voice deadly calm. You have exactly 5 minutes to leave before I call the police and have you removed for trespassing. Mom, come on, Tommy laughed nervously. You're joking, right? I pulled out my phone. 4 minutes. The guests began shuffling toward the door, muttering among themselves. Some were already calling Ubers. You deranged old fool. Amy stepped toward me, her finger pointed at my face. I moved so quickly it surprised even me, closing the distance between us until we were nose to nose. Call me one more name, I said, my voice low and dangerous, and I'll show you exactly how much fight this old fool has left in her. Try me. The color drained from Amy's face. She stumbled backward, grabbing the nearest suitcase. Tommy stood frozen for a moment before reaching for the second bag. Mom, he started. Get out. They walked to the door, Amy still muttering curses under her breath. Tommy looked back once, but I had already turned away, beginning to take down the tacky decorations they'd hung on my walls. After they left, I surveyed the abandoned party scene, tables loaded with untouched food, half-empty champagne glasses scattered everywhere, my grandmother's vase thankfully still intact. I began boxing up the catering trays. The local homeless shelter was still open, at least some good could come from all this food. The weeks after the party passed quietly. Too quietly, perhaps. But after months of chaos, the silence in my house felt like a blessing. I put everything back in its proper place, my reading chair returned to its spot by the window, my family photos back on the walls, my grandmother's vase centerpiece on the dining room table. News travels fast in small towns. Sarah, my friend who works in real estate, told me Tommy and Amy had rented a 2-bedroom apartment in the new complex across town. Funny thing, she said over coffee one morning, Janet from the leasing office is an old friend. Says they almost didn't pass the credit check, but Tommy's new salary just barely got them approved. I sipped my coffee and said nothing. More stories trickled in. Martha, whose niece lives in the same building, reported that the property manager had already given them 2 warnings about the state of their apartment during routine inspections. The place is a mess, Martha confided, shaking her head. Garbage piling up, dishes in the sink for days. Sound familiar? I just nodded, remembering my own kitchen during their stay. Then came word of the arguments. They weren't exactly subtle about it. The neighbors could hear them through the walls, Amy screaming about Tommy's pathetic salary, how she was sick of living in a dump, how none of her friends had to live like this. Tommy firing back about her refusing to work, to cook, to clean, to do anything at all really. They say she throws things sometimes, my friend Linda whispered during our weekly lunch. Tommy was seen sleeping in his car one night last week. Each story made my heart ache a little. Not for Amy, I was done wasting sympathy on her. But for Tommy, he was still my son, despite everything. Sometimes I pick up the phone, my finger hovering over his number, but I always put it down again. This is his lesson to learn, his path to walk. The house feels different now. Peaceful, yes, but also waiting. Like it knows this isn't the end of the story. Some nights, as I sit in my reading chair with a cup of tea, I look at the photos on the wall, Tommy's graduation, his first baseball game, the two of us at the beach when he was 10. I remember the little boy who used to run to me with skinned knees and broken toys, trusting that mom could fix anything. But I can't fix this for him. He needs to see it for himself, to understand what he's become and find his way back to being the person I raised him to be. Until then, I'll be here in our family home, keeping his room ready, just in case. Not for Amy, that bridge is well and truly burned. But for my son, when he's ready to apologize, to talk, to rebuild. In the meantime, I'm reclaiming my life. I joined a book club, started taking painting classes on weekends, and even adopted a cat from the local shelter. His name is Oliver, and he's excellent company. He sits with me in the evenings, purring contentedly as I read, neither of us feeling the need to fill the silence with empty words. Life goes on, as it always does. And when Tommy's ready, he'll know where to find me. While most of my friends' families revolved around their parents, in our house, my grandmother was the one who really called the shots. And honestly, she had every right to. She'd built our family's exclusive tableware store from nothing, turning it into a thriving business that made her quite wealthy. Your grandmother has always had an eye for beautiful things, my father would say whenever customers praised our store's collection. He and my mother ran the day-to-day operations now, but everyone knew who the real owner was. My grandmother had only stepped back to enjoy her retirement, not to give up control. My younger brother Tommy was being groomed as the heir apparent from the moment he could walk. He needs to learn everything about the business, my mother would say, while practically ignoring my existence. It didn't seem to matter that I was getting straight A's, while Tommy could barely be bothered to crack open a book. Who needs to be smart to run a store? Tommy would say, sprawled on the couch playing video games instead of doing his homework. I just need to know how to count money. Our parents would laugh at these comments like they were adorable, while I sat at the dining table working on my advanced math problems. But I had my secret weapon, Grandma. Every weekend, I'd go to her house, and we'd play what she called business games. She taught me everything about running a successful store, from inventory management to customer service, from profit margins to negotiating with suppliers. Now, Rachel, she'd say, setting up our pretend store on her living room table, if a customer wants to buy this crystal wine set for $500, but our cost was $200, what's our profit margin? Her eyes would twinkle as I quickly calculated the numbers. That's a 60% margin, Grandma, I'd answer excitedly. But we should consider our overhead costs too, right? She'd beam at me, pulling another gift from her seemingly endless supply. That's my girl. You understand business better than most adults I know. These sessions with Grandma weren't just fun, they sparked something in me. While my parents were busy preparing Tommy to inherit the store, I was making my own plans. I decided I would go to college and study business properly. When I turned 14, my life changed dramatically. I still remember that evening as if it was yesterday. My parents called me into the living room after dinner, and my father's stern face told me this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. Rachel, he said, looking at me with cold eyes, your mother and I have been talking. It's time for you to stop being lazy and help out with the family business. Starting tomorrow, you'll work at the store after school. The next day, I started my new job at our family store. Every day after school, while my brother Tommy went home to play video games and mess around, I was mopping floors, dusting shelves, arranging expensive china, and doing whatever else needed to be done. I worked hard, determined to prove myself. Sometimes I'd stay late into the evening, making sure every crystal glass sparkled and every display was perfect. After 3 months of working alongside the adult employees, I started noticing something that bothered me more and more. Every Friday, all the employees would receive their paychecks. They'd discuss weekend plans and what they were going to do with their earnings. Meanwhile, I worked just as hard, sometimes harder, but received nothing. One evening, when the store was empty except for my parents counting the day's earnings at the register, I gathered my courage and approached them. "Mom, Dad," I started nervously, "I've been thinking. I'm doing the same work as the other employees. Actually, I'm doing multiple jobs. Shouldn't I be getting paid too?" The look they exchanged made my blood run cold. My father's face hardened, and my mother's lips pressed into a thin line. "Paid?" my father scoffed. "Do you have any idea how much we spend on you? Food, clothes, that roof over your head, you think all that's free?" "But that's different," I argued. "Parents are supposed to." "Don't you dare tell us what parents are supposed to do," my mother snapped. "Consider your work here as payment for everything we provide for you." Many children would be grateful for such an arrangement. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but fought to hold them back. That's when my mother stepped closer, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper that I'll never forget. "And let me make something very clear," she hissed. "Don't even think about running to your grandmother with this. This is our business to run as we see fit. If I find out you've complained to her, you'll regret it. Understood?" For 2 long years, I worked without pay, watching other employees receive their weekly paychecks while I got nothing but tired feet and calloused hands. But as my 16th birthday approached, I made a decision that would change everything. The day after my birthday, I walked into my parents' office with my head held high. "I quit," I announced firmly. My father's head snapped up from his paperwork. "What did you just say?" "I'm not working here anymore," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "I need my own money, and since you won't pay me, I found a job at the Coffee Corner Cafe. They're hiring part-time after school." My parents exchanged alarmed looks. My mother recovered first, her eyes narrowing calculatingly. "Fine," she said slowly, "but on one condition, you tell your grandmother you're still working here. She doesn't need to know about this arrangement." As I walked out of that office, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time since I turned 14, I was taking control of my own life, and it felt amazing. My first day at Coffee Corner marked the beginning of my new life. The manager, Sarah, was nothing like my parents. She was kind, patient, and actually appreciated hard work. Every Friday, I'd get my paycheck, and that feeling was indescribable. For the first time in my life, I had money that was truly mine. I loved everything about my new job: the smell of fresh coffee, the regular customers who learned my name, and especially my coworkers who treated me like an equal, not a servant. The best part? I could finally buy things for myself without having to beg my parents. My first paycheck went toward a new phone, nothing fancy, but it was mine. The second one bought me some new clothes. But what I enjoyed most was being able to buy small gifts for Grandma. One week, it would be her favorite chocolates, another week, a beautiful scarf I spotted at the mall. "Oh, sweetheart, you shouldn't spend your store wages on me," she'd say, her eyes twinkling as she admired whatever small present I'd brought. Those moments were the hardest, lying to Grandma about still working at the store. She'd ask how things were going there, and I'd make up stories about rearranging displays or helping customers. "You have such a good eye for presentation," she'd beam proudly. "Just like I did at your age." The guilt would eat at me, but I kept reminding myself that this lie was protecting my newfound freedom. As senior year progressed, my grades stayed perfect. My teachers started talking about top universities, Harvard, Yale, Stanford. "With your academic record, Rachel, you could go anywhere," my guidance counselor said during one of our meetings. But I knew better. My parents wouldn't spend a dime on my education, they'd made that clear enough over the years. And while Grandma would probably help if I asked, I couldn't bring myself to do it. After years of being dependent on family, I wanted to stand on my own feet. So I focused my research on local options, and discovered that our city college had an excellent business program. Better yet, they offered full scholarships to top students. I spent weeks perfecting my application, and when the acceptance letter came with the scholarship offer, I felt like I'd won the lottery. The morning before graduation, Grandma visited me with a special gift, a stunning new laptop. "For my future businesswoman," she'd said with a warm smile, hugging me tight. "I know you'll do great things with it." That evening at the graduation dinner, with just my parents and brother present, I decided it was time to share my news. "I've enrolled in City College's business program," I announced, trying to keep my voice casual. "Full scholarship." The silence following my announcement was broken by my father's calculating smile. "Well, that's certainly convenient," he said, exchanging a look with my mother. "At least we won't have to worry about tuition." "Yes, you've solved that problem quite nicely," my mother added, wiping her mouth with a napkin. "Which brings us to our next point. Now that you're an adult and finished with high school, we need to discuss your living arrangements." "What do you mean?" I asked, fork frozen halfway to my mouth. "Rent," my father said flatly. "Starting today, you'll need to pay rent to continue living here." I laughed, thinking it was some kind of bizarre joke. But their faces remained serious, and my laughter died in my throat. "You can't be serious," I said, looking between them. "I'm your daughter." "You're an adult now," my mother countered. "We're no longer legally obligated to support you. This house belongs to us, and if you want to continue living here, you'll need to pay your fair share." My mind was spinning. "What about Tommy?" I asked, glancing at my brother who was unusually quiet. "Will he have to pay rent when he turns 18 too?" The way my parents avoided my eyes told me everything I needed to know. Of course Tommy wouldn't have to pay rent. Perfect, precious Tommy would never be treated this way. "That's different," my father muttered, not even bothering to explain how. "This is insane," I said, pushing back from the table. "I'm your child. I have a right to live in my own home." "This isn't your home," my mother snapped, her mask of civility finally cracking. "This is our house, and if you won't pay rent, you need to leave. Tonight." "Tonight?" I echoed in disbelief. "You're throwing me out on graduation night?" "You have an hour to pack your things," my father said, returning to his dinner as if he hadn't just dropped a bomb on my life. I ran upstairs in a daze, tears blurring my vision as I threw clothes and necessities into my bags. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip them closed. College wouldn't start for months. What was I supposed to do until then? My first thought was Grandma. She would help me, I knew she would. But when I called her number, it went straight to voicemail. Then I remembered she'd left for her annual trip to Hawaii just yesterday. She'd be gone for at least 3 weeks. I couldn't ruin her vacation with this drama. She deserved to enjoy her time off without having to deal with my parents' cruelty. Wiping my tears, I scrolled through my phone contacts until I found Jenny's number. We'd been friends since middle school, and her family had always been kind to me. 20 minutes later, I was loading my bags into Jenny's car, leaving behind the only home I'd ever known. As we drove away, I caught a glimpse of my parents watching from the window, their faces expressionless. In that moment, I finally accepted what I'd always known deep down: they had never really loved me at all. Life fell into a new routine during those 3 weeks at Jenny's house. Wake up on her fold-out couch before dawn, quietly get ready so I wouldn't disturb her family, work my shifts at the cafe, save every penny I could. Sarah, my manager, was a godsend during this time. She understood my situation and increased my hours without me even having to ask. Working helped keep my mind off things. I threw myself into every task, whether it was crafting perfect lattes or scrubbing down the equipment at closing time. "You're going to work yourself into the ground," Jenny would say when I'd come home exhausted after another double shift. But what else could I do? I needed to save as much as possible before college started, and staying busy meant less time to think about my parents' betrayal. I avoided them completely during this time. They never called or texted, and I was fine with that. What could they possibly say to justify throwing their daughter out on graduation night? Tommy sent me one message asking where I was, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. When Grandma finally returned from Hawaii after those long 3 weeks, I felt a surge of hope so strong it almost made me dizzy. I'd waited patiently, forcing myself not to contact her during her vacation. She deserved to enjoy her time away without getting dragged into family drama. But now, finally, I could tell her everything. With trembling fingers, I typed out a message: "Grandma, I need to talk to you about something important. Can we meet?" Her response came faster than I expected, but instead of her usual warm reply with a time and place, it was just a link. My heart started pounding as I clicked it, opening my mother's social media page. What I saw made my blood run cold. "My heart is breaking as I write this," my mother's post began, the words dripping with false sincerity. "Our beloved daughter Rachel has run away from home. But what makes this situation even more painful is discovering that before she left, she stole a significant amount of money from our family store's register. We tried to give her everything, to show her nothing but love, and this is how she repays us. We never thought our own child could do something like this." I stared at the screen in horror as I scrolled through the comments section, watching my reputation being shredded to pieces by people who'd known me my entire life. Aunts, uncles, family friends, all expressing their shock and disappointment in me. "I can't believe Rachel would do this. She always seemed like such a good girl. After everything you've done for her. This generation has no respect. You should report this to the police. Theft is theft, even if it's family." My mother's response to the police suggestions made me feel physically sick. "No, we can't do that to our daughter. Despite everything, we love her too much. We just pray she'll come to her senses and return what she's stolen. Our hearts are broken, but we still have hope she'll make this right." My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. The sheer audacity, the calculated cruelty of their lies, it was beyond anything I'd imagined them capable of. They'd thrown me out of my home, and now they were trying to destroy my reputation too. I drove straight to Grandma's house, my heart pounding the entire way. When she opened the door, her face was unreadable, but she stepped aside to let me in. "I don't believe that post for a second," she said before I could speak. "Sit down and tell me what's really going on." The words poured out of me like a broken dam. "I haven't worked at the store for 2 years, Grandma. Not since I was 16. I've been working at Coffee Corner Cafe all this time." My voice cracked. "I'm so sorry I lied to you about it." "Go on," she said quietly, her face growing darker with each word. I told her everything, about working for free from age 14, about my parents refusing to pay me because I owed them for living expenses, about their threats to keep me quiet. When I got to the part about them throwing me out on graduation night, Grandma's hands clenched into fists. "Those lying thieves," she spat, jumping up from her chair. She strode to her office and returned with a stack of papers. "Look at these payroll statements. According to these, you've been receiving a salary at the store from age 14 until now. They've been paying you on paper this whole time, even after you quit. Where do you think that money went?" My head spun as I looked at the numbers. Thousands of dollars, all in my name, all going into some account I'd never seen. Grandma was already on the phone. "James, I need you at the store immediately. Full audit. Every transaction, every account, every penny." She paused, listening. "And find out exactly how much money is missing from the register, the amount they're accusing Rachel of stealing." While Grandma made calls, I opened my laptop. My hands were shaking with anger as I began typing my response to Mom's post. I've stayed quiet long enough. Here's the truth, I didn't steal anything, and I didn't run away. I was thrown out of my house on graduation night because I refused to pay rent to my own parents, something they've never asked of my brother. I haven't worked at the family store for 2 years, I've been working at Coffee Corner Cafe. My parents kicked me out with nowhere to go, and now they're trying to destroy my reputation to cover their tracks. Want proof? Ask Sarah Mitchell, the owner of Coffee Corner, where I've really been working these past 2 years. Ask about my schedule, my paychecks, my performance. Ask why my parents waited 3 weeks to mention this theft, coincidentally right when Grandma returned from vacation. I shared the post with my friends and coworkers. Within minutes, Sarah had responded. I can confirm everything Rachel has said. She's been one of our most dedicated employees for the past 2 years, working after school and weekends. Her honesty and work ethic are beyond reproach. I trust her with my business, my customers, and my reputation. These accusations against her are completely false. Within hours of my post, our family's social media erupted into chaos. The same relatives who had condemned me days earlier were now turning on my parents with fury. How dare you throw your daughter out and then lie about her? You made her work for free since she was 14? You demanded rent from your own child on graduation night? What kind of parents are you? My mother tried damage control, posting lengthy explanations that only dug her deeper. You don't understand the whole situation. But people weren't buying it anymore. Every excuse was met with screenshots of my boss's confirmation and more outraged responses. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from my parents. I ignored them all. Instead, I stayed at Grandma's house, watching as her auditor and his team tore through years of the store's financial records. Rachel, the auditor, said one evening, his face grim, "We found something serious." The numbers were staggering. Year after year, my parents had been siphoning money from the store into their personal accounts. They'd created fake vendor payments, inflated expenses, and pocketed the difference. The salary they'd supposedly been paying me? That went straight into an account under their control. But that was just the beginning. The total amount, the auditor hesitated, is over $500,000. Grandma's face turned to stone. She immediately called a family meeting at her house. I sat next to her in the living room as my parents and Tommy arrived, my father trying to look confident, my mother nervously clutching her designer purse. "Sit down," Grandma commanded. "Do you know what we found in the audit?" "Mother, I can explain," my father started. "Explain?" Grandma's voice could have cut glass. "Explain how you stole from me for years? Explain how you pocketed your own daughter's wages? Explain how you tried to frame her for theft to cover your tracks." She slapped the audit report on the coffee table. $500,000. You stole $500,000 from me, while treating your daughter like a slave and throwing her out on the street. My mother burst into tears. "Please, we can work this out." "Oh, we'll work it out all right," Grandma snapped. "You have 2 choices. Either you pay back every penny you stole, or I press charges and you both go to jail for fraud and embezzlement." The color drained from my father's face. We don't have that kind of money." "Then start selling things. Your cars, your vacation home, everything. And you'll take out loans for the rest." In the end, their expensive cars were sold. Tommy's college fund was emptied. They had to take out massive loans to cover the rest. The beautiful house I'd been thrown out of was now mortgaged to the hilt. After the audit revelations, Grandma called an emergency staff meeting at the store and announced that my parents were no longer associated with this business in any capacity. The look on my mother's face as she was escorted out of the store she'd thought she'd inherit was something I'll never forget. "I've appointed Mark Davidson as temporary manager," Grandma told me over dinner that evening. "He's experienced, trustworthy, and most importantly, he knows this is a temporary position." "Temporary?" I asked. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Until you graduate." This store was always meant for someone who understands both business and ethics. That's you, Rachel. A week later, she made it official. The family gathered at her lawyer's office as she signed new documents, officially removing my parents from her will. The store and majority of my assets will go to Rachel, she declared, her voice firm. She's earned it, not by being born into this family, but by proving her worth through hard work and integrity. But Grandma's heart is too big to completely ignore Tommy. Your brother will receive a portion of my estate, she told me. He's not responsible for your parents' actions, and he's still my grandson. Tommy and I have grown closer through all of this, surprisingly. Without our parents' toxic influence constantly pitting us against each other, we found our way to a real sibling relationship. He stops by my dorm room sometimes, and we talk about everything, his struggles to adjust to this new reality, his own college plans now that his fund is gone, his anger at our parents for their betrayal. I'm sorry, he told me recently. For all those years I was such an entitled brat while they treated you so badly. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. As for our parents, I haven't spoken to them since that day at Grandma's house. They still try to reach out occasionally, birthday cards, holiday messages, attempts at reconciliation. I send them all back unopened. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt. Grandma comes to visit me at college regularly, usually bringing coffee from Corner Cafe. She's become a regular there since learning my story. We sit in the campus courtyard, discussing my classes and planning the future of the store. She's teaching me everything she knows about the business, just like she did when I was little, but now with real stakes and real purpose. You know what the most valuable thing in business is? She asked me recently. Integrity. Without it, no amount of success means anything. Your parents never understood that. But you do. Looking back at everything that's happened, I realize that while my parents' cruel treatment hurt me deeply, it also taught me invaluable lessons about who I want to be, and who I don't. Their actions showed me exactly what kind of business person I will become. Next year, I'll graduate with my business degree. The store that was meant to be my brother's by birthright will become mine by merit. But more importantly, I'll have earned something no one can take away, the knowledge that I succeeded not because of my family's advantages, but despite their obstacles. Sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as its greatest challenges. My parents thought they were punishing me by making me work in that store at 14. Instead, they were giving me the experience I'd need to one day run it. They thought throwing me out would break me. Instead, it set me free. And that expensive tableware store that started all of this? Just wait until you see what I do with it.